Hey guys, so this is really different. The reason we were having this little tag right before this episode is because you're going to be hearing something really different from us.
Yeah, so we're actually recording on 3 different sets of microphones for this episode. For one of them, we're recording at our local public library.
We might not have had the settings correct. It was very weird. We were in a time crunch. People were flushing toilets and you could hear the toilets running and it was a bit of a mess. So the quality of some of the recordings might not be that great, and we had another recording session before we had gone to the library, and then we've had a few since the library. At the early part of the episode, you're going to hear a lot of interspersing between 2 different recording sessions, and you're going to be like, why is the quality so weird and so different? And that is the explanation. Bear with us, there's a lot of really good information. Serge and I went to BookExpo, and Serge took a lot of notes, and he wants to relay everything he learned from BookExpo to you guys. We have conversations, we have discussions about book-related topics, about diversity, we talk about politics, which is really weird for us. It's a very long episode, I know. It's going to be one of our longest episodes yet. Please bear with us. I hope you will listen to the entire thing because there's a lot of insight in the publishing world. There's a lot of insight about books. There's a lot of insight from authors. And then you get to hear 2 idiots, myself and
me,
go
idiot.
into heavy discussions about things that we don't know much about, but we have opinions about.
Right.
And, when you have a podcast, you're allowed to do that. But
exactly.
There's a lot of talking about things that we don't normally talk about, that we will never talk about in a normal episode, I don't think. And you'll learn more about us than you ever really wanted to know, I think. And maybe you'll learn more about the publishing world and you'll want to know more. But we hope you listen, we hope you enjoy, and we are so sorry that you're going to be hearing so many different sets of recordings. And I know it throws you. I know when Serge reviewed some of it, it threw him.
Yeah, sorry guys. This is going to be a little bit of inconsistency in our sound quality here because of the very different tonal ranges and volumes that get mixed together.
We hope you enjoy.
Yeah, bear with us and have fun. We are going to talk about some really important things.
This is Rhett Read Podcast.
We take a deep dive into the Fear Street series
and review other books we've read.
I'm Serge.
And I'm Anna.
We're happy you can join us.
Hey there, Rhett Readers.
Hey, welcome back to a very special episode of Red Read Podcast.
We're actually recording in a different space. We're trying out our library's podcasting booth.
Right, so they set up a soundproof room in the library with a bunch of sound recording equipment, and we're going to see if maybe we're going to record some of our episodes this way.
So shout out to Sachem Public Library for that.
Yes, thank you very much to Chris, especially the tech librarian who helped set this up.
So we're actually here to talk about our adventures at BookExpo and BookCon.
Right, so we were able to get media badges to get in there. Our goal was to basically go to as many panels as we could and learn about the publishing industry as it is today, but also we wanted to get a lot of books because there were a lot of books getting released. We also wanted to get ourselves out there and talk to the publishers and the authors, so we got a lot of opportunities to do all those things.
It was a really nice opportunity, and we really appreciate the organizers of BookExpo and BookCon for letting us in there as media people, and we did learn a lot about the publishing industry. We were able to speak to a lot of different publishers. We spoke to publicists, we spoke to authors. I talked to other bloggers, other booktubers. I talked to librarians, booksellers, the whole gambit, and it was really interesting to learn how the industry works from top to bottom. Because at BookCon, you get to talk to all the consumers and all the people who are really into the different fandoms and the different books, who are there just purely as fans. Whereas at BookExpo, you're talking to people who are industry professionals, and it was so interesting just to get everyone's point of view. It was actually really nice to see how many young people, I'm not talking about teenagers, I'm talking about legit little children who are just really into books, who stood in line for arcs that I hadn't heard of and were just really passionate about reading in a way that I didn't see growing up.
Actually, I guess I didn't see a lot of the children as much because I spent a lot of time going to all of the panels. Not as many children there, it was more adults. there were some really interesting speakers that were talking about the various aspects of writing and publishing.
And while Serge was sitting and listening to really interesting panels, I was actually the one running around, picking up books, getting ARCs, getting autographs to give away to you guys.
Yes.
Which was, fun because I got to talk to a lot of people. But I'm sure everyone is really interested in what you learned at the different panels you went to. I know when we scheduled your days, you just had panel after panel.
I have to say I learned a lot about the publishing industry, and I do want to relate those things because I know a lot of you guys couldn't make it to BookCon because you don't live within easy driving distance of New York City.
You don't have a commuter train that would take you there.
We can hop on a train and be there in a little over an hour.
Let's go through all the panels. What are the panels you went to at BookExpo?
Before we do that, I did actually pick up a couple of books myself, and one of the books I was very excited to get was Hope Never Dies by Andrew Schaefer.
And it's courtesy of Quirk Books, and the publication date is July 10th.
As soon as this book became available on NetGalley, and I saw the cover, I knew I wanted to read this book. It's got one of the all-time great covers. If you haven't seen it yet, go and Google it. It's hilarious. Former Vice President Biden driving a muscle car with the top down, and Obama standing up in the passenger seat, like pointing the way. He's got this resolute look in his eyes.
So what is the book about? I assume it's a fictional book about President Obama and Vice President Biden.
Right, so in case you're wondering what this book is about, if you can't figure out from the cover, there's also a helpful little thing in the top right-hand corner. There's the presidential seal type of thing, and underneath it says, an Obama-Biden mystery.
That's exciting. So are they like detectives?
Yeah, they're detectives. The book starts out, some time has passed after Obama's no longer president, and Biden's kind of living at home, and he's kind of wallowing in self-pity because he thought that he and Obama were best buds, brothers. He hasn't seen Obama since they left the White House or whatever. He's basically stalking all of the social media and magazine posts about how he's kite surfing in South Africa and like hanging out with billionaires and just like basically holding auditions for a new best friend. It's kind of hilarious how Biden is just like this sad little puppy with Obama being gone. One night, Obama just comes back out of nowhere, and Biden doesn't know what to do. At the one hand, he's like really happy to see his old friend again, but on the other hand, he's really, really salty that he's been abandoned this whole time. And so things come to a head. I don't want to spoil too much, but Biden tells Obama like how he really feels.
So where does the mystery aspect of this come in? Is there a murder? Is there a crime?
If you guys know, back when Biden was a senator, he used to ride the Amtrak to Washington every day, and they used to call him Amtrak Joe. That's like one of the main premises of this book, is that during those days, he actually formed a really close bond with one of the conductors on the railroad. That's actually what Obama comes to tell him, is that this conductor has actually passed away in very mysterious circumstances. This, along with some other events that transpire soon after, lead Biden to believe that there's more going on than meets the eye, I guess, and he wants to investigate. He wants to dig down and find out what really happened to his friend and why he died. And there's basically like drug trafficking involved, and there's some like really high stakes action scenes that it is kind of mysterious. I feel like I kind of figured out who I thought maybe was the guy that did it, but it didn't really take away from the excitement of reading the mystery. I couldn't put the book down. I finished it in a couple of days, and I had a really good time. I think you can attest to the fact that I was just laughing my head off. It's a funny book.
I do remember while you were reading it, you were just laughing nonstop, and belly laughs, not like the polite chuckles that sometimes people do when they read, but just hardcore laughing. So it did sound like a really, really fun book. Do you think that the characters were in character?
No. I feel like we have a really goofy view of Biden. He's in so many memes now, and his brother-type relationship, his bro relationship with Obama is in itself a meme. This book, their characters grew out of those memes more than anything. Definitely Obama's character seems the most unrealistic because all of his good features of him were accentuated a lot, but only in regards to the Biden relationship. So we know Obama as kind of like a family man, but I don't think he ever talks about his daughters really in this book, for instance. Like, definitely just some aspects of the Obama character were taken and accentuated, and others are, like, very visibly missing. The Biden character is more fleshed out and, like, realistic, I would say. But at the same time, obviously not. Because he's got this hilarious self-deprecating monologue where he's always really upset about how he feels abandoned by Obama.
If you don't subscribe to their political ideologies, would this still be a fun book to read?
Maybe. I think it depends. What do you mean by you don't subscribe? I think if you've been watching a certain news media that has vilified these two men, then you probably wouldn't enjoy it because you're angry at them, right? If you're angry at them, then you're not going to enjoy a book about them solving a mystery and having a good time together. Your mind is going to be clouded by feelings of anger and dislike. If you maybe just don't like their policies, but don't particularly hate or dislike the men themselves, then yeah, absolutely you could like this. This book is not anything about policy.
I'm thinking more about your review of Myth and Madness, and I remember your answer when I asked you, like, if you didn't follow the Maidan like you did, if you weren't so invested in the Maidan, would you like the book or not? And your answer was a categoric no, the book was trash. I guess my question is, if you aren't particularly an Obama, Biden fanboy, fangirl, you didn't really, I guess it's along the same lines.
Well, first of all, this book doesn't have all the problematic issues that Myth and Madness had. So as a baseline, it's a good book. It has a good narrative. It draws you in. Let's say for our international listeners, right, if you weren't living in America for the last 10 years and you don't have any clue who Obama or Biden are, okay, that's fine. You're probably still going to enjoy it.
I think you can be outside the U.S. and still know who they are, for the record, but I see what you mean.
But maybe you didn't follow all the memes or whatever, and you don't really know what their main character traits. Especially Biden is not as much in the limelight, obviously, as the president was.
So as a book in itself, it's a good book?
Yeah, it's definitely a good book. I would give this 4 stars out of 5. It doesn't take itself very seriously, but it's also not trying too hard to be funny all the time. It strikes a really good balance there. The mystery is good. I don't read a lot of mysteries, so perhaps you take with a grain of salt my judgment of whether or not the mystery is good. I thought it was a good mystery, so I would give it 4 stars. I guess for me, in terms of the flaws,
I mean, there has to be a reason you didn't give it 5 stars.
I docked it a star because, again, yeah, I felt like Obama's character was a little bit less.
What do you mean less?
Just not as fleshed out. He felt kind of absent. And maybe that's because the whole book is from Biden's point of view, and he did, his main beef with Obama was how absent he was. Or aloof, he was more aloof. But maybe that's just how he is. I'm not sure. I guess we did talk to the publisher about this. There might actually be more Obama-Biden mysteries coming out. I don't know if we're allowed to say that, but I'm pretty excited. And hopefully we'll see Michelle Obama in an upcoming one, because that would be cool.
Yeah, were Jill and Michelle mentioned at all?
Jill was in the book a few times, but she was kind of just letting Biden do his thing.
Thank you to Quirk Books for providing us a copy of this book, and I know you got it autographed by the author himself.
Yeah, and we got to chat very briefly. There was a long line for this book. I didn't want to hold anyone up, but I just wanted to thank him for putting this out. The cover is hilarious. I'm pretty sure people are going to be buying this book simply because of the cover. And why don't I just shout out the cover artist who did an amazing job here. Jeremy Inesio did the cover for this book, and he did an amazing job. I described the cover earlier, and you guys need to go Google this. It's hilarious. One other funny thing, I was just flipping through the book to find out what the name of the cover artist is, and the acknowledgments at the beginning of the book. Thanks, Obama.
Thanks for that review, Serge.
I'm really glad that I was finally able to review something that I enjoyed, unlike the last 2 books on this podcast. Well, not counting the Fear Street books, obviously, those have been amazing.
Well, unfortunately for you, you not only reviewed an amazing book that you really enjoyed, but you also went to most of the panels, which you're going to talk about. I got to sit back and just listen to you talk.
Why don't we split up the work a little bit? You say the name of the panel.
So let's just start with LGBTQ+ authors on gender and identity in science fiction fantasy. And the panelists were Seth Dickinson, S.L. Huang, Charlie Jane Anders, and V.E. Schwab.
I guess when I signed up for this panel, I was pretty excited about it because it had V. Schwab in it, and we had just finished reading and reviewing her wonderful book, A Darker Shade of Magic, which we both really enjoyed, and actually helped us come up with an exciting new theory for the podcast, which we have called Schwab Theory. Tune into one of our previous episodes for that, but by the time I made it to the panel, I already forgot what it was supposed to be about or that V. Schwab was in there, and I was also running late. So I walked in late. I had no idea who was on the panel. It took me maybe 15 minutes to figure out that, oh my goodness, that's V. Schwab sitting right there. They were talking about LGBTQ plus issues in science fiction fantasy. So when I walked into the discussion, they were discussing metaphors in science fiction fantasy.
one of the interesting things that they were talking about was that a lot of times LGBTQ themes in science fiction fantasy are sort of masked in metaphor. And one of the panelists had the point that kind of strips away the specificity of the queer experience. What they meant by that was that every person in that community has their own experience, something they bring to the table with the life that they went through, any kind of hardships that they may have struggled through. When you kind of mask that in metaphor, it loses a little bit of that specificity, so it doesn't have that authenticity to it any longer.
And then also, sort of in the same vein, you often have queer characters being assigned to the aliens in the cast of the story. And the question was, well, does that kind of make it a little bit less legitimate? Because when you have the queer experience masked in the metaphor or assigned to an exotic alien species, does that strip away some of the specificity of that queer experience? The question is it bad or is it good? That was an interesting discussion that they had. One example that Seth gave was the DS9 character who was kind of like a lesbian, but not really.
Dax, Jadzia Dax, and later Ezri.
Yeah, so he brought that up. The other discussion then was that what is the interplay between creating diversity in the story versus bringing normalcy? And what they mean by that is, when is it going to stop being revolutionary or surprising to find a queer character in a story? People that are LGBTQ plus are all around us. And one of the interesting things they brought up is like, hey, why is it that there's always just one queer character, right? Why can there only be one? Why can't you have two or three, right? One of them, I forget who brought this up, but queer people don't exist in isolation. You know, they hang out with each other. I think Charlie Jane Anders mentioned that, you know, most of her friends were actually queer. They tend to travel in packs, I think one of them said. And so that's a good point. And this is actually the first panel amongst many this weekend that brought up the fact that, hey, you know, diversity is not about like including that one token diverse character. It's about representing what is around us in reality. So if you look at the breakdown of American society, what percentage are black, what percentage are white, and you go through, you have to realize that, okay, it shouldn't be revolutionary that not every character is a white male. It should be normal. It should be a reflection of the actual makeup of our society.
Well, this is the difference between diversity and representation. I know that a lot of people of color and those communities, that one big thing we talk about is diversity is all well and good. You know, having that token character, if that's the bone you want to throw, fine. But what we actually want is representation. What we want is, what does it mean for that person to be, you know, in my case, what does it mean for that person to be Asian American? You know, how does being Asian American affect that person's life in one way or another? Because it is a different experience. And by just having that person be Asian American and not do anything with it, that's the difference between having a diverse character within a group and having a character that represents. That's the discussion that minorities of any type have a lot in terms of how we are represented.
That conversation was continued throughout a lot of the other panels at BookExpo and then into BookCon. One of the interesting things that was brought up, this is a story that I now want to read. Somebody mentioned, I think it was Seth mentioned that Charlie Jane Anders had actually written a story called Love is Too Strong a Word. And the premise really hooked me. Basically, it's set in a society where there are actually 9 genders. You think, oh, okay, no matter what you are, you should be able to fit into like one of those 9 assigned genders. And the story is about someone that is not fitting in and is kind of like an outcast. And I think that's interesting, right? That's a classic sci-fi premise, that you have this outcast that doesn't fit into society. You know, society is too strict or too, you know, authoritarian and cut and dry, and somebody just wants to be a rebel and somebody just doesn't quite fit in. That's a very classic sci-fi theme, very classic literary theme. And then to set it in a society that is more open and diverse than what we have, more than we can even imagine, and still have someone that doesn't fit in. I thought that was interesting, so I'm definitely going to try to look that one up. Another thing that they discussed was what groups are still way underrepresented. I think they mentioned asexual, intersex characters, the need for more intersectionality. Also, they mentioned neuroatypical is an underrepresented type of character. And they finally closed with talking about their own writing styles. S.L. Huang and V. Schwab were talking about how, they wanted to write female characters that were the kind of female characters that they wanted to see growing up. An example that they brought up was that
when female readers read Sherlock Holmes, the traditional view of the publishers had been that, females like it because they want to be with Sherlock Holmes. And their takeaway was like, no, we're reading it because we want to be Sherlock Holmes. We want to be the guy that's kicking in the door, not taking any directions from anybody and doing his business. And why can't a woman do that? And so that was
something that they aspired to do in their writing. I think you can see that. I mean, I haven't read any of S.L. Huang's books, but I know she has a thriller out about a female assassin that's just kicking butt and taking names. Obviously, V. Schwab had that kick-ass female character in Darker Shade of Magic. Yes, it definitely shows in her writing.
Well, I mean, there's actually a series of YA books out about Charlotte Holmes. She's descendant of Sherlock Holmes. The first book is A Study in Charlotte, and it's basically Charlotte Holmes and her adventures with, I forgot what John Watson's progeny was, but...
Oh my god, they're still hanging out, with each other's, families or whatever?
It's a whole thing. I mean, just going to your thing, girls want to be Sherlock Holmes. In the series, you get Charlotte Holmes. And that series is by Brittany Cavallaro, for anyone interested in checking that out.
There's a lot of demand out there for non-traditional gender roles in characters.
And for some reason, all those books that are published with non-traditional gender roles, well, not all, but most of them are classified as YA, even though they're not necessarily YA. It's just because there's a female protagonist, and for some reason that means it must be YA to publishers. It's weird.
Yeah, and that theme actually came up in one of the later panels that I went to.
I was going to ask you some questions about this panel, but I know they all show up in another panel you're at, talking about very similar things, so I'll just save that for then. The next panel you had to run to was Turning Pages into Dreams, astronaut Clayton Anderson, and obviously the panel was with
Clayton Anderson, who is actually an astronaut.
A NASA astronaut?
That's correct, yes.
Isn't he famous for being rejected a million times?
He applied 15 times for the NASA astronaut program and got rejected. On his 16th application, he got accepted. This guy's pretty cool. He's from Iowa, from a little town, 1,500 people, and, he made it. So if you're listening and you're from a small town, he has some words for you. He has a recipe for success.
You don't have to just be from a small town to follow this recipe for success, do you?
No, you don't. It's a very simple 3-step recipe that will work for anybody.
What's step 1?
Step 1 is have a dream.
What's step 2?
Step 2 is persevere.
What's step 3?
Step 3, you don't have to be a genius. Even if you think that there are a lot of other people that are better than you at what you're trying to do, it doesn't mean that you have to give up. Keep following step 1 and 2. Follow your dream and persevere, and you're going to make it. It doesn't matter if there's people that you think might be better than you. Just keep going, and you'll make it one day.
He got rejected 15 times. He wasn't the best astronaut in the applicant pool. The first time, or the second time, or the third time, or the fourth time, or the fifth time, or the 11th time that he applied. But guess what? He kept going. He didn't let that stop him, and he succeeded. That's the 3-step process. It was fun. I got to meet an astronaut. That was very, very nice.
I actually met him after that panel to get an autographed book from him that he made out to you.
Yes, thank you for that, because I didn't have a chance to do that, because I was at another panel.
Yes, that panel was Pen America Presents, Can Free Speech Be Saved? And the panelists were DeRay McKesson, Jill Abramson, Jose Antonio Vargas, and the moderator was Katie Glenn Bass.
So this panel was actually really, really interesting. I think that probably this was my favorite panel of BookExpo America.
I thought that McKesson and Jose were both very well spoken and had really, really good points. And Jill Abramson was kind of from the traditional news media and kind of, I guess, the more conservative viewpoint there, and was not as interesting to hear from as McKesson and Jose.
Can you expand on that? I mean, I guess what made Jose and DeRay more interesting?
They were talking about the free speech issues that I actually care about, and it was very interesting to see what they have to say.
Well, can you tell us a little bit of what they had to say?
The first point that they had was that free speech for Black and brown people is not really the same as free speech for white people. And what they went back to was the protests in Charlottesville, Virginia, where we had the white supremacist march.
I know we haven't gotten very political on this podcast. We try very hard to stay apolitical. Sorry if we are your bubble away from politics. This Expo and Con, a lot of what people talked about was political, and it's hard to talk about what we saw or heard without getting into politics. So if we are your bubble away from the political world or the outside world, and you just want to hear our Fear Street reviews and all that, maybe just stop listening. But anyways.
What they talked about Charlottesville was that the white protesters were able to get away with things that they didn't think that brown or black people could do. They cached guns and ammunition around town, and they also shoved the police officers threateningly, and that is not something that was happening, for example, going back to Ferguson. In Ferguson, if they had been caching arms and ammo supplies throughout the town, that would have been a very different situation than the mostly peaceful protests that actually happened. I guess mostly peaceful is not the term I should be using to describe those. I did see a lot of the live streams. It was havoc. But had there been arms and ammo being cached by the protesters around the town,
we would have heard a different narrative, for sure.
It would have been utter insanity. Charlottesville went a little bit differently, and you had the white protesters shoving police. You had the white protesters killing somebody, and it went differently. And so they were saying, like, you know what? That was framed as a free speech thing, and the Ferguson riots were framed as
a riot. Like
as
you
a
just
riot.
called it a riot.
Exactly. I just literally called it a riot. That just slips right into your speech. Ferguson is a riot, and, Charlottesville is a protest. Yeah, so right there, they kind of proved their point right off the bat. The other issue they brought up was that the cable news networks do a great disservice to immigrants by the way they cover the topic of immigration.
Cable news networks do a bad job covering most things. When you have a split screen of like 100 people shouting at each other, it's very hard to get any point across.
The main point that they had about immigration was that why is it that when white people migrate to somewhere, it's whatever, it's fine. But when a brown person moves somewhere, then it's, why are you here? Show me your papers. Are you legal? That's kind of like how the issue is framed. The immigration issue right now is framed as, hey, we have Latino people coming from south of the border, illegals, quote unquote, so on and so forth. But there's people overstaying their visas from Canada and New Zealand and Great Britain and Ireland and whatever. Nobody cares about that, right? Or maybe they do, but that's not how the news media portrays it.
Well, it's like how Brits abroad are called expats. You talk about the expat communities in Hong Kong or something. But if you talk about the people from Hong Kong and the UK, they're called immigrants, and they're unwanted. It's just how you frame it.
Exactly. So there's a framing issue that they brought up. And it's all about speech, right? We're talking about free speech, right? It turns out there's aspects to speech that have a lot to do with how you frame it, and free speech for one group isn't necessarily viewed as free speech for another group. It's viewed as something threatening, something dangerous. It's something that we even see today with something that our president says today is viewed one way versus if our president had said it 3 years ago, it would be viewed completely differently.
The lady from the media, Jill Abramson, didn't really have much to say about that. I think she tried to defend it by changing the topic.
Her contribution was, I guess, supposed to be kind of a counterweight to the other two people, but...
How can you counterweight what they were saying, out of curiosity?
Well, she was supposed to be kind of from the media establishment. But I think the thing that really kind of affected what she was saying was the generational gap. She was certainly of a different generation than the two other speakers, and she just kept harping on Twitter and BuzzFeed and how they were killing the official established print media, and that's not really what the talk was about, but that's what she kept wanting to come back to, and maybe I missed her point, but honestly, I feel like she was diverting the conversation away from what the other two panelists were talking about.
I don't see how BuzzFeed is killing the published news industry or media, because the New York Times did sort of get all of BuzzFeed's top investigative reporters. So that's weird. Maybe BuzzFeed's killing them because they were doing amazing work, but It does have to do with the fact that all the clicks their videos get helps fund that.
One interesting thing she did bring up was that the demise of local news and local newspapers is a real crisis. And I think all of the panelists agreed on that, is that local politicians can no longer be held accountable to anybody because the local newspapers that used to cover that have basically gone extinct. Your local town councilman can do whatever, you'll never find out about it, and that's just the way it is.
But isn't that, in a way, where Facebook does step up, or Twitter does step up, where communities do form locally? You know, you form groups talking about what your local officials do. And isn't that sort of the antithesis of what she was complaining about in terms of social media?
One of the actual interesting things that I'm reminded of, now that you mention this, is a point that was brought up by DeRay McKesson. And what he said was, he spent a lot of time back in the day trying to convince people with facts. You think that this is a thing, but actually, if you look at the statistics, blah, blah, blah. And someone actually told him, listen, man, you don't bring facts to a culture war. And that's kind of the thing. If you look at a lot of what the media is going for, it's not about facts, it's about emotions. It's about triggering people's emotional responses to something. And the facts are really secondary or tertiary. It's not that big of a deal. And I mean, it's a little bit of a radical outlook, but he's saying listen, this is not how we win people over. That's an interesting turn to the free speech discussion that came here. That was you know what? Free speech isn't always about getting the facts. It's about winning the hearts and minds, I guess. So it was a pretty radical discussion that happened here. The other thing that he talked about was that, somebody asked him hey, how do I convince somebody, if I have a different political opinion than somebody, how do I convince them that I'm right and they're wrong? And he's listen, you can't preach to these people. You can't rattle off all your sources and say well, this TV personality said that, and this website I read said this, and obviously you're wrong because of that. We're all stuck in our own little bubble of perception. And so you're not going to really convince anybody. So what he said is, you're just wasting your own mental energy trying to convince people of something. Don't rattle off facts and do it that way. Instead, what you have to do is you have to put the mental work in their court. You have to challenge them to think about it on their own, and maybe they'll come to the conclusion that you want them to. But don't waste your own mental energy on it, because that's just going to drain you.
That's actually a theory in psychology that I had to study, where it basically says the same thing. But the concept is basically the more you push, the more the person will resist, and you might push them further into their way of thinking because they're defending their way, and that is unhelpful. But if the person doesn't strongly believe and you don't push, it's easier to change their mind. If it's a deeply held belief for them, even if you put the ball in their court, they still won't change their mind. It's like this whole psychology theorem.
But at the end of the day, I think the point is don't strain yourself mentally trying to convince people of your point of view. It's not worth it. You're not going to convince anyone, and you're just going to give yourself a headache.
Going back to the name of the panel, can free speech be saved? Is there hope for people who aren't white men, I should say?
Yeah, so of course there's plenty of hope for free speech, and there's people exercising their free speech every day, even though there's others that try to put it down. Free speech is alive and well. Here we are recording our free speech, So
it looks like you had a little break, and then you went right into a panel called The New Classics of Science Fiction and Fantasy. And the panelists were N.K. Jemisin and Anne Leckie, with the moderator Rosie Clark.
So Rosie Clark had a lot of questions in this panel, and it was basically question and answer session, and we kicked off with this one. It was very controversial questions. Should old classics be shelved? Are there some books that are just a little bit past their expiration date, starting to stink a little bit? And N.K. Jemisin dove right into that one, said, you know what, Fahrenheit 451, she grew up like a lot of us reading that book, going oh yeah, wow, this is a pretty good book. Classic sci-fi book, right? She reread it recently. Turns out the book blames minorities and blames political correctness for the death of books. And she was like, what? No, can't have that. So that was pretty controversial. And Lucky kind of declined to comment. She didn't want to stir up controversy by calling out Ray Bradbury for being racist or something. N.K. Jemisin also mentioned that there shouldn't really be a litmus test for sci-fi fandom. A lot of people make these lists of classics, and if you haven't read such and such books, then you're not really a true fan of sci-fi, right? And she's saying, like, you know what? That shouldn't be the case. If you like reading and you read some books and you really enjoyed them and they're sci-fi books, then you should count as a fan of sci-fi, even if you haven't read Asimov or what have you. I thought that was a fair point.
But that whole thing still persists in that community.
Yes, that community is
gatekeeperish.
It's prone to things like that, right? It is. There's also some talk about speculative fiction versus sci-fi. They were talking about how the spec fic versus sci-fi debate fits into the whole literary versus sci-fi debate. So literary fiction versus science fiction fantasy. A lot of people kind of lump all the sort of genre writing into the dustbin of literature, and literary fiction is supposed to be the cream of the crop, the crown jewel, you might say, and then science fiction fantasy is kind of set aside. And they were saying, like, actually spec fic is almost like a way of dressing up science fiction fantasy to make it more palatable and more like literary fiction. Is actually a more mainstream way of packaging it.
Well, I mean, that's what Atwood did with Handmaid's Tale. She didn't call it sci-fi. She said, I write speculative fiction. And I think Ishiguro, who had just won the Nobel Prize in Literature recently, he also doesn't write genre fiction, even though a few of his recent books can be considered some sort of genre fiction. He's like, no, I write literary fiction. They just happen to fit in these genres, but I don't write genre fiction. How do they feel about the genre they write in being considered like dustbin or trash? Because I know, even talking to your parents, your mom often tells me, oh, I can't believe Serge, he's never read a book. And I say, well, look at all the books he's read. They're all there. She's like, but these aren't real books, and it's science fiction and fantasy.
N.K. Jemisin really was very opinionated about this. And she was talking about the problem being how people's opinions of science fiction fantasy is basically stuck in books written 50 years ago. 50 years ago is what, like 1970 now? You think about books that came out back then, Asimov was writing, Arthur C. Clarke was writing. These are still considered to be like the classics of science fiction and fantasy. In a lot of literary circles, when people think science fiction fantasy, they're thinking about these old books with a spaceship on the cover that came out back then in the 60s, or even Lord of the Rings. And she's saying, you know what? There's people writing today, books coming out every single year, and if your opinion is stuck by something that happened 50 years ago, then you're uninformed. You're simply uninformed, and the problem is that a lot of these book critics or literary critics are just stuck in this uninformed opinion where they haven't caught up. They don't understand where the genre is today. And she sees it as this American anti-intellectual viewpoint of fancy versus fanciful. And it's basically founded in her opinion, these are her words, Protestant/Calvinist bullshit.
She's got opinions.
Yeah, she's got opinions. The whole thing is it realistic fiction, or is it like a spaceship on the cover sort of book?
Well, it seems like the genre has two big issues, and they come from both sides, where you have the literary critics and maybe the lay people who just see science fiction fantasy based on the 1960s, 1970s. They still associate with the crappy B movies that came out as well. So you have that. But then you also have the people who are hardcore into the fandom, who are gatekeeping, using those same standards and refusing. Both sides basically are refusing to see what the genre is becoming.
Right, exactly. But the genre is changing, and it is not what it was 50 years ago, and basically people need to wake up and realize that.
I've read Heinlein back in college, and I've read something he's written since college. Reading the book, I think it was Starship Troopers. It wasn't very sexist, but there was still some sexist things in there. But it made me go back and look at The Moon is a Harsh Mistress, and there is a lot of sexism in there. And then you look at a lot of the old sci-fi, and it is like extremely, extremely sexist and problematic in ways that nowadays I don't see it being as big as it was back then. And I just think it's interesting how that is an amazing change that genre has made, and probably due to the fact that there are more female writers in that genre. I mean, if I think back to the old 70s, 80s science fiction fantasy, I think Anne McCaffey is the only one I can really think of. Oh, Ursula K. Le Guin as well. And that's 2 out of however many other male sci-fi fantasy writers.
Yeah, and that leads into the next question that they were discussing, which was representation in science fiction and fantasy. N.K. Jemisin basically came in and said, like, that you're still running into these great representational black holes in science fiction fantasy, and she's not actually seeing significant change. and it is a big problem. And Lucky was talking about that this could actually be because of the kind of people, it could be like a selection bias, basically. What is kind of the traditional path to becoming a writer? You go to a particular MFA program, so you have to come from money, you have to have a certain kind of upbringing that leads to that. You end up in a kind of like selection bias in terms of the literary fiction. So Lucky thinks that maybe science fiction fantasy could be a little more DIY, and that might end up leading to slightly better representation going forward with that. But a lot of the problems here is there's still kind of a different demographic balance. Authors and publishers need to recognize that they should more closely represent the audience that they have. The demographics are shifting.
I know when we were at BookExpo and BookCon, just visually looking at the people that are there, it was pretty homogenous.
What I saw was that it was mostly women, actually.
So there was actually an article that came out that says that the publishing industry is mainly women. And I know that in the website that I saw it, which is very well known by everyone, I'm sure, the comments there were like, well, see, people always talk about how it's a very male-dominated field. And look, it's actually full of women. What they don't realize is that in the upper echelons, it's different. So yeah, there are a lot of women working on the marketing side, the publicity side, even the editing side, but those aren't the people choosing the books that are going to be published.
Right. Even just manning the bookstores, the libraries. If you're walking around the halls of BookExpo, you're seeing all the people involved in bringing books to us. Vast majority are women, but if you see like who's the person that's wearing business formal that everybody's looking to and serving on, okay, yeah, those are like 80% men.
Yeah, I noticed that actually a lot of the CEOs for the publishing companies I saw, because people would be like, oh, that's the CEO for, blank and blank publishing. They were men. That's the issue. But I'm not just talking about male versus female. I'm just talking about I didn't see many Asians there. I didn't see many black people. I didn't see Muslims. It's
a lot of Muslims at BookCon, though, actually.
Not working. I'm talking about in the industry.
Right, and that's going back to, it's New York City, right? So the demographic is that there's a lot of black people. Yeah, guess what? Black people read books, too. Muslims read books.
Yeah, so...
They were all there at BookCon, and then at BookExpo, it's all white women.
Right, that's the thing. Like, you can tell the difference in demographic between BookExpo and BookCon. BookCon, you see the diverse New York City crowds there at BookCon, but at BookExpo, which is more industry-sided, yeah, I felt very, oh, look, I'm an Asian person in a sea of white people. And I went out of the way to talk to the Asian American authors, actually, the Asian authors, and I did specifically thank them for representation and writing representation. Yeah, they were obviously happy to hear that because... hey, there weren't many of me around.
Sure. And basically, this goes into another issue that they discussed, and is white men can't be the only people writing female characters. Because when a white man writes a female character, it comes off a little bit differently. It's not the exact same character as if it was written by a woman.
Well, I'll give an example. I read Artemis by Andy Weir. The main character, I think she's somewhere from the Middle East, but it was quite obvious that the book was written by a guy, a white guy. Just how she was written as a woman, she didn't come off as like a real woman. She came off as if you asked a guy to write a woman. And I know this sounds like kind of sexist towards men, but there is a certain way that women are perceived that book just came off, and I just read it and it's just rubbing me the wrong way the entire time. Why is she doing that? Like, this doesn't make any sense. Like, this is such a stereotype. At one point, she's really stressed out, so she just starts binge reading gossip magazines because, oh yeah, I like reading about this gossip, celebrity gossip, or some really weird thing. It's been a while since I read the book, but it just really struck me as like, but this is like, if you got all your ideas of women based on watching TV or movies that are written by men, this is how you think a woman would react, but it is just really odd.
And they talked about this issue too, and what Anne Leckie had to say about own voices versus diversity. She's saying that it's up to the author to make their own choice, what characters they want to put in there. There's nothing wrong with writing female characters. There's nothing wrong with writing lesbian Arabian female character if you want to, and you're a white man. Okay, that's fine. But what we're saying is, let's bring in more of the different demographics that make up society into the writing industry, into people that write books, because they're going to bring that different perspective. When they write those characters, they're going to look different. They're going to feel different. This is about making sure that the center of society is able to empathize with those on the margins. And it's about having stories and books that have representation is important.
Well, I know a very, very big author recently got in a lot of trouble for complaining about what you just said, actually. She said that, it's really unfair to white authors because if an author that had some sort of intersectionality wrote a book, he'd probably get published over someone like her who's a white woman because of the push for diversity within the industry. And she said that it's complete BS and it should be more merit-based and not forced.
If you're writing a book and it's kind of not a good book, then maybe you should not have as high of a chance of getting it published as somebody who wrote a better book. I don't think I want to disagree with that, but I think it's very controversial, what she's saying. There's more to a book than just the quality of the writing. There's also the story being told, and it's up to the publisher in the end to decide whether the story is worth being told or not.
Well, I remember reading a story about there was an Asian American male, and he was writing a book about an Asian American experience, and publishers were turning his book down. And some of the notes he was getting from them was, your character isn't Asian enough. Why isn't there a scene with your character eating dumplings? Or why isn't there a scene with your character, making sushi? I don't remember what his background was. But it was just, so stereotypical. Why isn't your character eating kimchi? This character clearly isn't Asian enough, so we're rejecting your book. And that comes from the whole idea of, if you have a homogenous upper echelon who's approving these books that doesn't understand what it means to be Asian American, guess what? I don't eat kimchi or dumplings or Chinese food every day. We eat food that is outside our Asianness. So what happens when you have that lack of diversity is you start putting diversity into a box. And you feel like if you have this diverse character, these boxes have to be checked. And if they don't check all the boxes, they're not suitably diverse. I think that's what the complaint is. It's more, hey, we need to have these people at the top who understand what's going on. And it can still be merit-based because there's going to be a lot of Asian American writers. I'll stick with Asian American because that's what I am. But I'm sure there's a lot of Asian American writers who are actual crappy writers and they're not being published, but the good ones are. It's not like every single Asian American writer is being published. But on the flip side, it's not like every good Asian American writer is being published. And there is that crazy bottleneck where you aren't really separating the chaff from the wheat, as the saying goes. It's sort of just a free-for-all for minorities. Recently, on Twitter, there were actually some Black authors talking about rejections they had gotten. And one of them was rejected from a publishing house because they already had a Black author. That's such a weird thing.
Right, and having a token Black author is bad enough as it is, but let's say the new applicant was better than the previous one. It's no. We already have one.
We have our quota of one. We don't need a second one.
Yeah, we're not even going to evaluate you. There's something wrong with that. What if this guy was just a really good author? Why not just have him in your pantheon of authors anyway? The excuse that, we already have another Black author is the most bullshit thing I've ever heard. I mean, that's just nuts. You could say we compared you to everybody we already have and they're all better than you, but you don't meet our standard of authorship. That's fine, right?
But the problem of that even is there was another Black author. She was talking about how she was up for an award for her book. I think the story was everyone had to read a passage from their book that was up for the award. The selection committee had already made the selection or whatever. So she had read her thing and someone else had won. But someone on the selection committee had actually gone up to her and was like, you know what? I had never really thought of reading those words in that way. Had I heard you read this book and had I had that kind of voice while reading the story, I probably would have chosen your book over the other book. So even just saying you should just choose based on these arbitrary standards, like I said, if it's so homogenous at the top, at the upper echelons, then you might not be used to having a voice like that. So you're selecting out things that might be different, but different in a good way. So that's still sort of an issue that needs to be addressed.
I think that goes beyond the issue of race or representation, because honestly, if you're going to talk about the homogeneity issue, there are so many different unique voices among writers. It doesn't matter if you're Black or white or Asian or Latin American or whatever. So many different experiences, so many different voices. And now we're touching about something else, because you could have a really unique experience that is just a little bit outside of the norm, but it could be communicating something really important, something vital, and it could be getting missed.
But the thing is, when it's just one group of people selecting what the norm is, that's what your issue becomes an issue in diversity.
So I think it goes beyond gender and diversity. I think it's an overall issue of
diversity. The issue is diversity.
Oh my goodness, diversity.
I mean, I don't know what you're trying to argue, but I think the overall issue is the lack of diversity. That's really what the argument is.
Absolutely, yes, exactly. And I think this goes back to the argument that was made a little bit earlier in this panel, where people in publishing, the people that are writers, they come from some MFA program somewhere. It takes a certain amount of money. It takes being from a certain social stratum to be there, and it kind of self-selects for a certain type of person. And maybe that's the problem. Maybe there's like a weird self-selection bias in the publishing industry. They need to look outside of that. And the thing about publishing is that books are meant for everybody. If you want to appeal to a wider audience, if you want to get more people reading books, people want to read about the kind of stuff that they have experienced also. Yes, there's escapism. Yes, you want to read about other things, but there's also something about having something from your own experience to touch back on.
Well, going back to your thing of escapism, so I recently read a book called Children of Blood and Bone by Tomi Adeyemi. And that is pure escapism. It's a fantasy book. But the thing is, it's rooted in like Nigerian mythology. I think she uses Nigerian in the book. I don't speak Nigerian. I don't know any Nigerian, so I can't really speak for how good or bad or whatever it is. But the thing is, that book written from someone who isn't white is so mind-blowing because it brings something totally unique from a very diverse, very different point of view from all the other fantasy that we've been fed our entire lives. It is escapism, but it's rooted in something that is in our world. When you talk about the self-selection in the publishing world, the thing is there are people who want to read their own stories, but there are people who want to read escapism. But wouldn't it be cool if the people who want to read escapism also get a little bit of that real world flavor that they don't always see? There was also a book called Forest of a Thousand Lanterns by Julie Dao. For me, that was crazy because it was like a Chinese retelling of the evil stepmother or whatever. For me, reading it is escapism. It is like mythology. It does have like magic and whatever. But the thing is, all the characters are Chinese. All the characters are from my background. And it was really cool for me to have this cool thing that I could read but relate to in a totally different way that isn't like American Panda, which was a very realistic fiction story about a girl that could basically have been me. That is something like relatable fiction, and that brings something totally different than Forest of a Thousand Lanterns that was very escapist realistic. You know what I mean?
That's a really interesting point because we're talking about science fiction and fantasy, right? And that's something that is escapist in a lot of ways, very often. And escapism is very accessible because it's something that we all want. Even if you have escapism from an own voices standpoint with some kind of non-cis white male writer perspective, guess what? It's still going to appeal at that basic level of hey, I'm not in my 9-to-5 grind anymore and I can escape to another world. That does appeal to a lot of people. That's universal. So there's no problem to get these other voices in there, to get that perspective. And by the way, it's going to pull more people into the genre. It's going to pull more SFF fans in because they're going to see that connection that maybe they wouldn't see otherwise.
I was just going to add the two books that I had mentioned previously. Both of those feature female protagonists. So you might not know or remember this part from Gilmore Girls, but at one point Lorelai and Suki have a catering company, and they're catering a child's birthday party that's Lord of the Rings themed. So at one point this little girl in the party was like, "The boys told me there aren't any girl hobbits." And Lorelai says, well, that's because they couldn't be in the movie because they're doing something even more important. And then she says, have you ever heard of a Brazilian bikini wax or something, to try to make the girl feel better?
Oh.
And it's one of those things growing up, little kids do face that, even teenagers. You want to pretend to be someone or you're thinking about all these stories. And I was listening to a podcast where these two female authors were talking, and one had mentioned that she didn't realize every story that she had ever written up until some certain age, I think she was in college or something, every single one of her main characters was a guy, was a male. And she didn't realize how supremely messed up that was until she thought about it, why can't women go on these adventures? So the fact that these two books that I had mentioned that are actually pretty big, I know that Children of Blood and Bone has a movie deal, so that's going to be really cool.
That book was huge. All of our book on our BookExpo, that book was just exploding.
Right. Pro Book Nerds actually did a really good interview with her that people should check out. But anyways, the point is, teenagers, or even, younger than teenagers, will be able to read these stories, and these girls will be able to say, hey, yeah, women can go on adventures. Women can have these journeys. And it's super empowering as well. And it's great to see that happening in the publishing world, but it's so slow. And there's actually so much ridiculous backlash. There shouldn't be that backlash.
No, absolutely. And if you're a publisher, you want to sell books. That's like how you make money. That's how you pay your employees. That's how the whole business grows. You want to grow your audience. So have those own voice as writers, because guess what? That's just going to bring more people into the fold. People who didn't think they wanted to read a science fiction fantasy book are going to read one and find a way to connect with it that they wouldn't otherwise have. And then guess what? They're just going to start reading other science fiction fantasy books. And they're going to like it too, because it's a good genre. But you got to get them in the door. You're not going to get everybody in the door if you're just laser focused on one set of writers and ignoring everybody else, because there's something that other people can bring to the table that those people can't.
We had spoken earlier about the gatekeepers within the science fiction fantasy community.
Right.
And I think news, because I don't know if you guys have realized, but we are recording this part, which sounds very different from the previous parts, weeks later, because Serge had to be away.
I was on a ridiculous business trip that lasted way too long.
So there's actually just been news out recently about Worldcon, a whole bunch of issues that they've suddenly faced with the old guard and the pushback from the new people, but then the pushback from the old guard. Some people have just become troglodytes. They don't want to move with what's happening.
Right, but the thing is, like, for those people, there's still going to be authors that write in that way. But we have to grow the entire fandom. Obviously, we got to bring more people in, bring more authors in. It's literally good for everybody. A rising tide floats all boats, right? You expand the number of people that are buying this genre of book. There's going to be crossover. You're a cis white male author with his sexist views. His books are still going to sell more copies because there's just generally more people buying science fiction fantasy books. They might end up disliking those books, but guess what? They're still going to pay for it. And vice versa. A lot of those gatekeeper, sad puppies, losers, they're going to end up, out of curiosity, going to buy a lot of these other quote-unquote diverse books, and they're going to find out, oh, guess what? There's some good ideas in there. A lot of the stuff that I grew up really liking about science fiction, these people are carrying the torch forward, and they can get over the fact that there might be a female or other race or both main character, because the story's going to speak for itself. At the end of the day, books are something that can cross all boundaries and bring people together. So I believe that we need to break down the barriers and bring more people in. Absolutely.
People really should have an expanded perspective of all these things going on.
I mean, this panel was just like, I really got into it. Anne Lucky, N.K. Jemisin, I mean, this is star-studded. These are some like really top-notch authors at the peak of their game. I would just go back to that panel again and just listen to it all over again. So the next question that they had was, what about social media? It seems to give greater access to writers because writers have their own Instas, they have their own...
N.K. Jemisin is all over Twitter. I see her on Twitter like every day. She's great. I love her.
She does. Yeah, so she was talking about that. She's like, she has no problem yelling at people on Twitter. This is literally a quote. This is an N.K. Jemisin quote. She's like, I'll do it all day. Doesn't matter. She doesn't care. She's like, she's very opinionated and she lets it be known.
There was nothing wrong with that. That's great. They're allowed to have personality.
She let it be known at this panel. I have to go and read all her books, by the way, which apparently she was very good at plate tectonics in her world building. I actually flipped through her world map of one of her books at a bookstore recently, and I was like, oh yeah. This is totally correct with plate tectonics. But anyway, so Anne Lucky had something to say about this. She said that she actually ended up getting a little bit stressed out for the second book in her series because of Twitter. People were just, I guess, bugging her about it. Don't bug Anne Lucky, all right? Because I guess she's a little bit sensitive about the Twitter. Also, apparently, she actually had to make something explicit that was implicit. Because she actually had a Twitter conversation with somebody and she was like, oh, I didn't realize that this wouldn't just be understood. I guess the answer to the question is depends on the author. If you're N.K. Jemisin, you believe what you believe and you're just going to be militant about it and you will just like let people know your opinion. That's that. And if you're Anne Lucky, then you're going to be a little bit, oh my God, I don't know, people are freaking out. And then you'll also possibly even change the way you write the book based on user feedback, which is kind of cool because this is a level of interaction that we haven't had with the author before. I mean, I guess we could write letters, but those letters would get to the author after they published the book already or something. You had to handwrite it and like buy a postage stamp and put it in an envelope, and it's just, now you just sit back on your couch and just thumb it into the phone. Definitely way upgrade.
In 5th grade, we had to do a project where we had to write to an author. So every student had to pick an author of choice. And then some people got cool letters from the publisher. Some people actually got letters from the author, which was really cool. Unfortunately, I chose an author that was already dead for many, many years.
Oh my god.
I didn't know. I mean, Boxer children books are still coming out, guys. Who would have known that Gertrude Chandler Warner was not alive?
That kind of wraps up that panel. I think it was really on point. I grew up being a huge science fiction fantasy fan in middle school and high school, and this was just really good to catch up with the new avant-garde of the genre. I definitely need to just catch up and read.
Did you just say new avant-garde? Isn't avant-garde like the weird shit?
So I really wanted to catch up on these books. We actually have one of Van Lecky's novels here in the house, and I just haven't gone around reading it yet.
I got it on a blind book buying thing on my birthday.
Right, we talked about that in an earlier episode, I believe. So we've had that since like February, and I haven't read it, and Anna hasn't read it. And
Good on you for remembering what month my birthday was.
Yeah, wow.
Congratulations. So the last panel you went to that day was The Endearing Appeal of Fairy Tales and Myths. The panelists were Laini Taylor, Rena Rosner, and Naomi Novik. So what was the panel about?
So each of these people has written a book that was influenced or in some way based on fairy tales. When I say fairy tales, I don't just in general mean some kind of like folk mythology. I'm talking about like actual fairy tales that they grew up with as children. In some cases, fairy tales that were not really part of the folk mythology of anything. I think one of them based her book on something she thought was an ancient fairy tale from her country, but actually had just been written quite recently by an author and just inserted into a book of other fairy tales.
Wasn't that Naomi Novik?
I believe so. I came to this panel because, as you all know, I'm super into mythology. So this was like right up my alley. I was very excited, and I don't think I was disappointed at all. This was a very interesting panel to go to, and clearly a lot of fans showed up. I think these are pretty popular authors. Right off the bat, the question is, okay, why fairy tales? Why do we want to bring fairy tale back into modern writing? It's an old storytelling format. In the modern perception, it's aimed mostly at children. As a writer of adult literature, why do you want to bring the fairy tale and incorporate that into your story? And we had some different answers. First of all, let's go back to the childhood story aspect. By intertwining a fairy tale into your storytelling, it is actually an intimate way to get into the reader's brain because something is going to hark back to their childhood. You're going to connect with people on a very basic level because they're going to see the direct connections to, even if only subconsciously, they're going to see those connections to their childhood, to what they grew up with. There's going to be a level of comfort there with the story. Author hack. How do you hack your reader's brain? Oh yeah, connect to their childhood.
Isn't that the same theory that we're seeing with all the TV shows and movies being brought back?
Absolutely. No, it's a surefire way to make some money, right? Another way to look at it is, how do you move your story forward? You have this plot, you're working on some characters, you're working on a story, and you get stuck. You get writer's block. Everybody talks about writer's block. All the writers get it, right? Turns out, for some people, fairy tales are a really good way to work past writer's block because you already have a skeleton, an outline in place. It can serve as a guide. It can guide the author down the story. You know, maybe you had some ideas, you had some path you want to take the story down, and as you're writing it, it just doesn't seem to work. You're getting stuck. Go back to those basics. Go back to the beginning. What did your mother read to you as a child that really worked for you? And then get inspiration from that and move the story forward with that. So that's another way of looking at fairy tales being incorporated into modern fiction. What are fairy tales, right? They have staying power. They are myths, they are legends that have stayed with us. And it's just another form of folk tale that has been passed on for generations and generations. This is what we pass on to our children time and time again. Fairy tales kind of let us deal with our lives, with what is happening today, with what has happened in the past. Fairy tales can teach us that lesson, and they can teach us that lesson at a young age, and then we can carry that with us. It's a way of dealing with the darkness in the present and in history. It kind of prepares us, it arms us for the struggles we have to go through in adult life. Each of us has this myth hole that needs to be filled, and this is the power of tropes. Okay, we're all like, oh, this is tropey, blah, blah, blah. Okay, so tropes are tropes because tropes work. Cliches are cliches in storytelling because it works. It's a thing that hooks people. That's why it's called a hook. If you're going to go back to fairy tales, those are full of those. Those are known ways to get the story to be popular, to pass down for hundreds of generations possibly. It's a tried and true method. Kind of like a guide, like, hey, if you want to have a book that's successful, why don't you just base it on some other book that was really successful, or, story that was really successful, something that's lasted for many generations. As far as the myth hole thing goes, each culture, no matter where you go on this planet, and this is something I've learned over the last few years, no matter where you go, there is a mythology that is part of that culture. And these are things that are just passed on, part of the people's identity. We all need this. In a lot of modern society, I feel like people are missing that. And that's the myth hole. There's something inside of you that is longing for that mythology, which gives you a sense of belonging, a sense of fitting into the grand tapestry of history, to belong to a certain place, to an area, by way of passed on knowledge. And if you're missing that, which a lot of us are in this modern world, where you're just an anonymous person in a giant city somewhere full of anonymous buildings and nameless streets and just glass and steel and emptiness, loneliness, maybe the only way you can find that is through books. And so by bringing in and reusing those same formulas, you can actually appeal to that audience. And I think that was something that they were talking about.
So in a way, it's sort of like appealing to your inner child, right? Is that what that kind of is?
Absolutely. Or appealing to your inner missing childhood. Because maybe what you're missing is that mythology that normally gets passed down through fairy tales.
It's also a quick and easy way to sort of get the point of your story out there, isn't it? So, for instance, Naomi Novik's newest book, Spinning Silver, is kind of a retelling of Rumpelstiltskin. And by knowing the story of Rumpelstiltskin, perhaps you would get something out of the book. So I don't know the story of Rumpelstiltskin. I told a friend about the book. He's the guy who recommended Uprooted to me. And he said, oh, is it a retelling of Rumpelstiltskin? And I said, I have no clue what Rumpelstiltskin's about. The book involves turning silver into gold or something. And he was like, oh, okay, it's sort of like it. But I had to look up Rumpelstiltskin later, and I was like, oh, I see a lot of the parallels. I remember in my review of Spinning Silver, I had written something like, oh, it's really interesting how Naomi Novik's made an interesting point about anti-Semitism. And it's very, well done, blah, blah, blah. And then as I read the Wikipedia of Rumpelstiltskin, people were like, oh yeah, it makes an interesting point about anti-Semitism. It's like, oh, if I had known the story of Rumpelstiltskin, then I guess I would have been expecting this book to go the way it had gone. But because I didn't know the story, I didn't have that background. So it's just sort of interesting to me, like, if you know the basic premise of the fairy tale, you know what the moral of the story is, you know where the story is meant to go, then you can probably have expectations or surprises in how the retellings go. But if you have nothing coming in, then you're going to be taken for a ride, and you might actually miss something while reading the book.
This is a really good point. And if we go back to my review of Coyote Tales, I think it ties in with this panel discussion, because one of the points that came up is that one telling of a story does not close off other tellings. And in fact, if you think about it, fairy tales are an oral tradition. Nowadays, maybe not so much, because the Brothers Grimm wrote down a whole bunch of fairy tales, and now people just read that to their children over and over again. In some countries, for many generations, fairy tales have just been repeating the same written story. But where did the Brothers Grimm get their stories? Oh, they got it from people who told those stories verbally. And where did those people get their stories? They heard it from the previous generation, and they heard it from the previous generation. They heard it from the previous generation. And each storyteller adds their own twist to the story. Society changes. We evolve and we advance. And retelling a fairy tale in a new way, as a novel, as a science fiction or fantasy story, fits right into that tradition. It just dovetails right into that. And going back to Coyote Tales, guess what? These are traditional folk tales in the Native American tradition, but they've been adapted to our modern sensibility and our modern way of life, and it still makes sense, and they're still relevant and vibrant and beautiful today like they were 100, 200, 300 years ago.
There was actually a new book from the We Need Diverse Books people. It's an anthology book called 1,000 Beginnings and Endings. And that actually brings 15 Asian myths, folk tales, fairy tales into not necessarily the modern world. Some of them are brought into the modern world. Some of them are retold in a modern way. That's a great way to introduce people to myths from all around the different parts of Asia to an audience that wouldn't have seen it before. And they have an interesting way of introducing different morals to you. Like, the cool thing about these fairy tales and the retelling of fairy tales is just seeing, like, the different ways that different cultures pass on stories with morals to children in order for them to do things or to not do things that are just different from one another.
Sure. Another way of looking at it is that even if you retell a different story, that's still going to appeal to people. You could actually travel through the same story many different times, and it's really all about how you tell the story. We often actually reread our favorite novels, reread our favorite books. But what if you reread your favorite book, it had just like a little different twist on it? That would be really cool also. You know, incorporating favorite childhood story plot lines into your book, that's like probably a pretty good way to do it.
You mean a Harry Potter where Harry and Ginny don't end up together?
Oh my god, I'd buy that. Going back to having fairy tales growing up, what is really the point of the fairy tales? And there's several different ways that they work, and one of them is a fairy tale can help by teaching us how to cope with the things that we have to go through in life. Every family has a fairy tale. It can become magical in its own way.
Can I ask a really basic question?
Okay.
What makes a fairy tale different from, like, a story? What makes a fairy tale a fairy tale? Like, what makes the Berenstain Bears not a fairy tale?
It's a fairy tale.
So the Berenstain Bears are a fairy tale?
Absolutely.
Or like
the talking bears? That is some fairy shit right there.
Or like the little critter books? Or like Frog and Toad?
Yes.
So are those all considered fairy tales? Like, what makes something...
I mean, those are basically a modern day fairy tale, right?
But they're not labeled as fairy tales. My question is, what gives something the distinction of a fairy tale? Like, when I think fairy tale, I think maybe Little Red Riding Hood. I think that's a fairy tale, but then I think the Berenstain Bears are like a kid's story. But all the Berenstain Bear books have morals. You know, the Berenstain Bears and the Messy Room.
Let's break it down this way. Now, this might be revolutionary. Maybe nobody's thought of it this way before me, but let's break it down this way. Little Red Riding Hood, she's going through the forest and she's going to give her grandmother some bread or something, and the wolf comes and eats her grandmother or whatever. That's like a European fairy tale. Nobody in America, as far as I know, wears a riding hood. What the heck is a riding hood anyway? We don't ride no horses, right? I mean, okay, maybe in the countryside, but do they wear a riding hood? So the point is, it doesn't really relate to us and whatever, but Berenstain Bears, you know, maybe it's more relatable. Maybe Berenstain Bears is the new American fairy tale.
I mean, I know it's at the core of the Mandela effect, but I've never heard it being referred to as a fairy tale.
Yeah, but I'm saying, like, every country has its own, like, mythology, its own, like, set of stories that get passed down to the children. Guess what? We got Dr. Seuss, we got the Berenstain Bears. At some point,
because basically
America's not Europe anymore, right? And we gotta have our own shit.
So are those considered fairy tales? Because, like, from what I'm hearing, from what you're saying, is that fairy tales are stories told to children via an oral tradition, and then now it's been written down.
Yeah.
And they usually have some sort of morals that teaches the child a lesson.
Yes.
Or there's, like, a grander story. So, like, a lot of mythology talks about, like, the building of the world or, like, the big flood or something. Or then there's, like, the trickster tales about Coyote. So you hear about those in terms of mythology. And then in terms of fairy tales, you just think of, like you mentioned, the Brothers Grimm. And all of those are, like, stories about tricksters and kids learning things the hard way. Hansel and Gretel, Cinderella. Like, those are all classic fairy tales that I think of. So I guess what determines you consider the Berenstain Bears or Little Critter or Frog and Toad or Dr. Seuss fairy tales, but I've never heard it referred to that as a fairy tale before. So by people aside from yourself, like, what gives it that label? Like, why would it be considered a fairy tale? Like, what is a fairy tale? I guess what I'm hearing is like, oh yeah, and then they can be retold in modern times. So like I said, Spinning Silver is like a fairy tale retelling of Rumpelstiltskin. Is it just a story that you can replace the different parts and it would still be the same thing?
It just depends who you ask, you know. Honestly, it's almost like a racially loaded term because fairy tale, honestly, there's a word right in there, fairy, right? What's a fairy? Oh, fairy is an element of European mythology. And so if you're going to talk about fairy tales, then it's really just European myths that are told to children. And then it pretty much excludes everything else. And that's a very narrow definition.
But the thing is, like, even when I think of mythology, like, I would separate mythology from fairy tales. Like, when I think mythology, I think the Greek gods or the Roman gods or the Norse gods.
That's where the racism comes in, because now you have this Western European bias. And you go like, well, the Western European mythology is fairy tales, but, the classical tales. But guess what? The stories about the Greek and the Roman gods, I think part of the problem with that was that those a little bit got supplanted by Christianity. The Greeks and the Romans were the first to adopt Christianity. I guess they were pretty zealous, and so a lot of that stuff got wiped out. But if you look at, Western Europe and Northern Europe, adopted Christianity about 1,000 years later. A lot of their folk traditions got kind of just jammed in with there, didn't get completely wiped out. And so when we look at Greek and Roman mythology, we're just talking about like old books that got passed down for 2,000 years. And when we're talking about Northern and Western European fairy tales, we're talking about folk traditions that were allowed to coexist with Christianity. It all goes back to European history, right? But at the end of the day, what do people tell their kids? They tell the kids their old folk traditions, their old folk tales, which goes into mythology, which goes into their oral tradition. And where you go around the world, it's going to be the same. But when we look at the stories from around the campfire that are recorded from Australia, recorded from South America, recorded from North America or Pacific Islands or wherever, we as Americans, being part of the Western European cultural tradition, just think of it as mythology. We just bunch it in along with Greek myths and Roman myths as some kind of pagan tradition. But fairy tales get a jail free card is some kind of exclusion.
Almost.
I'm sorry?
A different category.
Yeah, but it's really the same thing. It might even go back to just differentiating between what is accepted in your culture, even though it's different from your religious belief, which is Christianity, which has its own set of traditions and stories and beliefs, which are separate from fairy tales, versus all of these other folk traditions, which are not sanctioned by Christianity necessarily, and are other, and then that's referred to as myth, and that was convenient because we already had a category for that. Coming from that Western European tradition, we already had a category for things like that, because that was what came before Christianity. That was the Greek and the Roman traditions, which got passed on. And so everything else neatly fit into that category, and we called it myth. But it's really the same thing.
Basically, you're using Christianity as this demarcation line. So pre-Christianity is mythology, post-Christianity is fairy tales?
Post-Christianity, family traditional stories that somehow managed to sneak in past the fact that none of these things are technically kosher in Christendom. Yeah. Things like Easter rabbits or talking frogs.
So the Brothers Grimm, did they collect stories from oral traditions from the past, or they didn't make these up?
They didn't make them up. They went from village to village.
Because I know they did it during the 1800s.
Yeah, absolutely. And you go to the villages, there's people that know all these stories. This is stuff that got passed down for millennia. Yeah, of course it changes. The story changes every time it's told, right? But this is the core of the old tradition, and it's still there. And it got recorded because the Brothers Grimm recognized something that a lot of people recognized around the same time, and it's that we gotta write this stuff down or it's gonna get lost. Because what happens, we have urbanization, people are moving into the city, they're moving out of their old village, and they're forgetting the tradition, and the oral tradition is getting lost. Because every village has its own oral tradition, every little region has its own oral tradition, and when everybody moves into the same big city, forget about it. It's gone. It's like hitting a big freaking reset button. And the Brothers Grimm were like, we don't record this stuff down right now. It's going to get lost forever. And they weren't the only ones. That's how we have a lot of these myths and legends books right now, is because people freaking went around the countryside and just started recording oral stories all over the place. Not just Europe, all over the Americas, all over Asia, Australasia, wherever. Because it's a freaking emergency. When you have this globalized urbanization, you're losing all these old traditions, and you gotta write them down.
So now that we've fully deviated, let's go back to the panel. Sorry, I mean, you kind of answered it for me. I'm still, I guess having that demarcation thing makes a little more sense, and how it's a little haphazard. I mean, I still question the validity of calling the Berenstain Bears a fairy tale, but whatever. Or Amelia Bedelia. I don't know.
And full disclaimer, I am not a fairy taleologist, so this is just my own humble opinion.
Well, physicists have quote-unquote humble opinions about everything, so...
Right. Yeah, so let's just talk about some of the other points that they made during this panel, which was very educational. I feel like, my point that I was trying to make just now is informed by this discussion. So a novelist says in words what cannot be told in words, is what somebody said during this panel. That's pretty deep, right? Let me just read it out again. A novelist says in words what cannot be told in words. Isn't that interesting? What does that mean? They can tell you a truth through creating context in a story that removes you from your daily preconception. It allows you to say something that if somebody walked up to you on the street today and told you the exact same thing, just said that sentence, you would deny it, or you wouldn't even understand it. It would be completely foreign to you. You just wouldn't understand what they were trying to say or what they wanted to tell you. Or you would say that's absolutely wrong. But what a novel allows you to do, you can, over a number of pages and chapters, create an entire environment and immerse your reader in that environment. Put you in somebody else's shoes that is in that environment. And then allow you to use your own empathy that you were, as a human, pretty much born with. And then understand something that was said. And then it could be that exact same sentence that in your regular day-to-day life, walking down the street, somebody would say to you. And you would be shocked, you would understand it, you would reject it, but while you're reading the book, those same exact words would actually convey meaning that you would understand, and you might find some kind of message in that you could relate to, or agree with, or open your mind to new possibilities. And that is kind of the power of storytelling. It's really interesting that it was brought up in this panel. I feel like that's pretty deep. And part of that goes back to, it's really hard to open your mind to something that you don't expect to be true, that's not part of your daily preconception, that's outside of your bubble. But a novel allows you to travel someplace else. We already talked about escapism. Well, when you're escaping to that other place that's outside of your day-to-day norm, that means you're there. You're part of it. You feel that experience. And then things that make sense in that context can come through to you. It's an interesting way to deliver a message that you wouldn't otherwise be able to really understand.
I wonder if it does a better job doing that than other mediums like TV or movies. Because think about a show like Star Trek, obviously had a very specific, very interesting messages that were very progressive for its time. Like they had the Uhura Kirk kiss in the 1960s, I think the show was out. And that was like mind-blowing for people. But then you have the people who watch the different Star Treks growing up, the different incarnations, and they're all pretty consistent in their messaging. But then you have Star Trek Discovery that's come out, and then you have the people who just rage against it. There are legitimate things to be upset about. For instance, why is the universe that small? Why does everything have to involve the Enterprise and Spock? But anyways, that's not the point.
So your points are legitimate and theirs aren't, right?
No, but why, no, their issue is that, why are they trying to shove diversity in our face? Why is the main character a black female? Why is there an Asian female captain? Why are, blah, 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 blah. And their gripe was with diversity, but the thing is, like, Star Trek was always known for its diversity. And the fact that they're arguing against it because they didn't choose to feature a white male, and they chose to feature females of all ethnicities, that really drove them crazy. And it's like, well, they were able to sit and accept the message for, the original series, for Next Generation, for DS9, for Voyager, for Enterprise, But then when they got to them actually going all the way with one of their messages, people all of a sudden just decide to stand their ground and put their heel into the ground and say, no, I refuse to accept this, right, even though they've accepted this before. So I guess my thing is, if the argument that they were trying to make is that reading a novel immerses you and it gets you these messages that you wouldn't have thought otherwise, and maybe it'll change how you think about it in the real world, subconsciously almost. Is it just because it's the written word it has that effect on you? Because I've seen the effect it has on people in terms of TV shows and how people have really decided to dig their heels in and been like, no, dumb social justice warriors ruining our favorite series. And it's like, what show have you been watching for decades?
The point is that fantasy allows you to say something that could not be said in the everyday context. So Star Trek allowed people to say something that couldn't be said in the everyday context. You couldn't have Kirk and Uhura kissing each other if they weren't wearing Star Trek jumpsuits. If it was just some random sitcom set in everyday America, I guess it would have been less acceptable at the time. So in that way, it works. And then what about in the modern day when you have another show in the same series pushing the boundaries further and people are upset about it? Why don't we go
really pushing the boundaries?
Well, no, but why don't we go back to the 1960s or whenever original Star Trek came out? Why did we even hear about Kirk and Uhura kissing being a big deal? Probably because at the time, people made a big deal out of it. And now we have Star Trek Discovery and there's people making a deal out of it. Well, that's probably always going to happen. There's probably always going to be people griping about whatever show that's trying to push the boundaries. Maybe it's not any different than it was back then. Maybe it's the same proportion of people as before. Maybe those people thought they were Star Trek fans too, and then they saw that episode and they were really up in arms about it. Maybe there's just always going to be some percentage of the population that's just made uncomfortable by things like that. That could be part of it. So this was the last panel of the day. After this, we carried back 70 freaking books in various tote bags, and our shoulders were bleeding and it was awful. But we had one more day of Book Expo and 2 more days of BookCon to go after this, and plenty more books to carry back and plenty more panels to go to.
So, on the next day of Book Expo, you started your day at joining Secretary of State John Kerry as he discusses his new book, Every Day is Extra.
Every Day is Extra, the title of the book. If you're curious about what it means, John Kerry lays it out right at the beginning of the panel. Actually, it's not a panel, it's like a talk. He kind of just stood on the dais and lectured us about his book. So it's just a philosophy that a lot of Vietnam War veterans brought back with them from the war. And it means living responsibly to keep the faith with those that didn't make it back. It's pretty straightforward. It's a solemn vow that those people took. It means that you believe that being a bystander is worse than failing. If you try and you fail, that's okay. But you can't just stand by and let things happen and not do anything at all, because that's the worst thing. It's a pretty simple philosophy, and it's led a lot of these people to a life of service to the country and society in general. So coming back from Vietnam, he was actually inspired to participate in the first Earth Day. He went and talked about how that kind of dovetailed into him participating in the Paris Climate Accords, and how being in the environmental movement has been with him his whole life, going from participating in the first Earth Day to, cure, whatever that means, and ocean conferences.
My eyes are glazing over.
Iran deal. He talked about that. I mean, I know my eyes glazed over during his talk too. The guy's just this old dude that is just a little bit
patting
boring.
himself on the back. He's talking about all the great things he did.
Yeah.
And I'm sure if you guys check out his book, you'll hear more about it, but we need to move on.
Yeah.
That's the end. Thank you for that.
I just relate one little anecdote. This is just going back to it didn't seem very relatable.
Can we move on to the next panel? Your next panel, because I am firmly done hearing about John Kerry, is the We Need Diverse Books Presents Life Cycle of a Diverse Book. The moderator was Marietta Zacher, and the panelists were Alvina Ling, Sarah Hines, Beth Phelan, and Renee Watson.
This is actually a very interesting panel and very fitting for Book Expo, because Book Expo is all about the publishing industry, and not just the publishing industry, but also just the whole book industry as a whole. But coming as we are from the podcasting world, although we are a book podcast, we don't really know much about publishing. We don't know much about how a book gets made. At least I don't. Maybe Anna knows a lot more. This is one of the great educational experiences that we got from coming to Book Expo, because the life cycle of diverse book, while also talking about diversity in books, is actually talking about overall the life cycle of a book. What they have here is they have representatives from each step in the life cycle of a book. They have an author, and then they have an agent who represents that writer, and then they have an editor that may take on that writer, and then finally they have a bookseller. So once the book is born, so to speak, a bookseller has to then sell that book to people and make a profit. This is every kind of step of the life cycle. So we have writer, agent, the editor represents the whole publishing house, and then we have the bookseller. Let's go through this life cycle together from the beginning, and hopefully we can all learn together about how a book is made. I mean, this isn't Schoolhouse Rock, but I'm going to try to make it interesting for you guys, okay?
You don't have a song prepared for us? You don't have a little cartoon or a graphic that we can put on YouTube?
Yeah, sorry.
You've had this much time. I'm so disappointed.
Yep. Yeah, so sorry guys about the time, by the way. I was unfortunately off on a
the other
trip,
side of the world.
Gone for 5 weeks, so it is what it is. So anyway, to begin with, we have Renee. Renee Watson is an African American, and therefore what she's relating to us is from the perspective of the diverse author. Renee is the author of Piecing Me Together, and she is the start of the life cycle. So Renee Watson, as a writer, she needs to think about the craft and the writing, making a good story. And from her point of view, she just tries to tell a nuanced, creative story, which is what all authors do. When she's writing the book, she's not actually focusing on, I'm from a minority, I need to do the minority thing. She's an author, so she's thinking about author stuff. She wants to write a good story. That's the primary focus. She's doing her best in order to tell a nuanced and creative story. She wants people to close the book, come away with some questions. this is a good point. Like when I watch a good movie or I read a good book, I come away and I go like, okay, this is interesting. Like I have some theories, this is the hallmark of a good book or a good movie, a good poem, or even like a good painting, something that makes you think, right? That's why we value art. As an artist, this is what she strives for. So another thing that she mentioned is she also wants her audience to be able to come away from reading her books and feel that they are seen and that they are valuable. To be seen is to not be invisible. If you feel invisible, if you feel unvalued, and you read one of her books, perhaps you're going to feel the opposite of those things. So maybe go check out her books because that sounds great. That sounds like a really positive experience. At least that's what she's aiming for. So as a person, she has things she cares about that show up in her books. That's normal. She also does want to push back against stereotypes. This is something that a lot of minority communities struggle with, is that there's stereotypes out there. Being an author of color, you kind of almost have that responsibility, I guess, to be the one that pushes back against those stereotypes. And you could see it as a burden. I don't think she does. And she's always thinking about the intersections of race, gender, and class. And this is going back to intersectionality. Getting the publishing industry and books and literature as a whole to really represent us. Because you're not just one thing, right? I'm not just an immigrant. Anna is not just Asian American. There's many, many dimensions to us. You can't just pigeonhole people based on one thing and then go with that. So intersectionality creates deeper characters and actually creates a more rich reading experience for the audience.
That's why that hashtag own voices movement is happening, isn't it? It's because of that pushback from within different communities to get their stories out there. Pro Book Nerds did a really interesting interview with N.K. Jemisin and Ann Leckie at BookExpo. Adam had asked something along the lines of, is it okay for someone who's not within a community to write a story about the community? It was either N.K. Jemisin or Ann Leckie, but one of them had mentioned, like, you can write the stories, but you can write something with that character, but it shouldn't be featuring, in the sense that a cis white male maybe shouldn't write a lesbian coming out story for a, Asian American.
Sure.
When someone who's not from a group tries to write that group's story, there's something off about it, and that they're basically, I think it's like, it's commodifying someone else's story. How there's almost something, not sinister, but just something wholly not necessarily in good faith about that. I mean, I am obviously paraphrasing really horribly. Check out the interview that Adam had done with them on
We'll
Pro
put a
Book
link
Nerds.
if you're watching the YouTube, there's going to be a link. Riffing off of that, I just want to say, I just finished reading C. Robert Cargill's new book, which is called We Are Where the Nightmares Go. And I was enjoying this book very much until I got to the end, and I was extremely put off. There was a story about Australian Aboriginal traditional characters doing Australian Aboriginal traditional magical medicine man type stuff. The main character was a white dude who was like learning their rituals and stuff. I mean, there's probably a way to do that right, but when you have like a white American author writing that is 2 degrees removed from the way to do it right. That's all I gotta say. I'm also like white or whatever, but it just didn't feel right to me. It felt like really messed up. And maybe it's because of my perspective of reading a lot of mythology that gave me some context. It just didn't seem like the right way to go about things.
So I read that story, and that was my least favorite story in that book of short stories, which I thought was a phenomenal book of short stories, but I got to that one. And first of all, it's like a sequel to another story that he had written, so already you're behind on the curve, but it also just didn't sit right with me either. But I think it's funny because he actually wrote the script for Doctor Strange.
Mm-hmm.
So the whole thing with Doctor Strange is a white guy goes to a monastery and learns the old ways. But the thing is, the magical person, magical, old, knowledgeable one is a white woman.
Right. And it was supposed to be like some old Asian monk or whatever, right?
Right.
Yeah.
And they said, we didn't want to have an old Asian monk guy because we thought that would just be racist or weird and it'd be a stereotype, and people were like, how is this better? And I just think it's funny that your issue with this story is that white guy learning the old magical ways. It's like he learned, maybe I shouldn't do that. This white guy would just learn the old magical ways from a white woman who learned the old magical ways already.
Are you saying maybe he wrote this story before he wrote the script for
Doctor Strange?
Doctor Strange?
I have no clue what the timeline was. I have no clue about anything.
If he learned his lesson, he wouldn't have published this story to begin with. At this point, it was a little bit too late to throw the book because, well, first of all, I was reading on my Kindle. I'm not going to throw my Kindle because I love it. But secondly, it was the last story in the book, so I was going to finish it. And it had a lot of good elements. I enjoyed. Again, I'm a sucker for mythology. It had a lot of mythological elements. It was great. I love the concept of the dream time. And despite Australian myths not quite clicking with me, I gotta say, that is one of the mythological traditions that I haven't really clicked with so far. The basic concept of it, I am very much in love with.
Wasn't it just that one story that put you off Australian mythology, though?
The medicine man goes rogue and eats all the people and then digs a pit and shits all of their digested remains into the pit. The farts from his shits stink so bad that everybody else dies also. Yeah, that was an epic revenge story, let me tell you. Woo!
Well, this goes back to the mythology panel, kind of, that we talked about, but when you read these books of mythology, are they written by a person from where the myths come from? Do you think that there is a certain bias from whoever writes it? Oh, these are noble savages, and these were their ideas of what stories could be, in almost a weird high mighty way of writing it, so that it does come off almost backwards just because there's a weird superiority thing, whereas if it was written by someone who understands the tradition, it would come off differently?
It's funny that you say this because I read another book of Australian myths and legends, which was written in the 1800s. And it was done most certainly by a noble savage, high and mighty, yada yada guy. And these were great. This is really, really polished myths. This is some Greco-Roman stuff. The book that really turned me off from Australian mythology, this speaks towards me more than the Australian mythology, but these were transcribed from tape recordings and translated literally without any bias whatsoever.
So do you think that maybe the bias comes from a lot of the myths that we see actually weed out the scatological ones? And when you go down to it, don't we all like poop jokes or fart jokes? And maybe they're just no, we can't have these being propagated. Maybe there's a lot in Greek and Roman mythology with Zeus is farting on the mountain.
Right,
and,
so this
the thunder comes from his gaseous farts or whatever.
Yeah, exactly. So this is my own personal bias. I have a bias where I expect my myths and legends to be all Tolkien-esque. So I come at it from Tolkien, which is completely backwards, right?
Oxbridge professor.
Yeah. It's terrible, right? This is terrible, but this is the truth. So then when my myth and legend doesn't have the freaking Valar riding down from the heavens and defeating Melkor, I am a little bit upset. So when the myth has fart jokes, I am just devastated, right? And maybe that's authentic to that culture, but I just don't get it. And that's more on me than on them. I fully own that. It
reminds me of American Panda by Gloria Chow. She mentions Chinese people, we have a lot of sayings that involves poop. So one of the things that the characters in her book says, "Biao tuo ku zi feng pi." It's don't take off your pants to fart. I just remember there was a review that was well, this is really gross. Why would you say this? Who says something like that? It's I don't know, normal people. But it's they associate those really pithy, Confucius type things with Chinese philosophy.
Right.
So when you have a philosophical saying that involves fart or poop, immediately, how dare you? And I feel that's kind of your reaction with this myth.
Yeah, I mean, I'll probably go back and revisit it, but I feel we've gone way off topic from the diversity panel here.
Own voices,
jeez. Let's talk about the next step in the life cycle of a diverse book. We have the agent. By the way, I didn't even know about agents. This is a new thing that I just found out. There's these people called agents.
Are you being serious?
Okay, I realize now that you're probably thinking dude, you've been watching BoJack Horseman this whole time. How can you not know about agents? I don't know.
Wait, you didn't know about agents in general? Not just in the publishing world, just in general?
Okay, Princess Caroline is an agent, right?
Yes.
Okay, yeah. I totally...
Princess Caroline is also a manager.
No, okay,
she was his agent and his manager.
Okay, yeah, but you know what? I knew about agents because Princess Caroline, but anyway, hey,
and also, Frasier had an agent.
I never watched Frasier. So Beth...
That is such a lie.
Beth is an agent.
You're such a liar.
Beth is an agent. Let's talk about what agents do. She always asks, what do you want readers to take away from this story? It's just something that agents say to their authors. some editing is actually involved. As an agent, you will actually try to polish that turd just a little bit before you send it off to the editor. But they try to stay true to what the author wants to say, so they're not gonna really go overboard. Editors are pretty freewheeling, and agents are more in the author side of the court, I guess. Now let's get down to the nitty-gritty of what the agent actually does. So Beth, what she does is she comes up with a pitch letter. She wants to pitch this book to the publishing people. So she's gonna make a letter. This book is amazing. You gotta get this out there. People need to hear the word. What she likes to do is she also likes to keep the author in the loop. You've been rejected from publishing house A, and publishing house B says this is utter crap. She just keeps the author in that loop constantly. What else does she do? Oh, and she also gets to make the decision as to which editor gets to work on that thing, which is pretty cool. But as an agent, you have some experience, okay, maybe this editor is gonna be able to understand what's going on with this story. And this is where it comes in too, because probably if you're a diverse author, maybe you want to have an editor that can understand where you're coming from with that. Anna just mentioned this earlier, where people were getting rejections from publishing houses because they just didn't freaking get the story. You have some Asian author writing a normal freaking story with some Asians in it, and they're like, well, you're an Asian author and you wrote some story about them Asians, but they weren't eating dumplings, so we're going to reject this. If you have an editor that is also Asian American, they're probably not going to reject it on that basis. So now that we have the agent, we're coming to the editor. Alvina Ling is actually an editor. She works at a publishing house, and she often receives pitch letters from agents trying to get their diverse authors out there. So the editor will decide which books to pick up or not. And then when they decide, okay, I'm going to take this book on, this is good stuff, what they have to do is they have to go to the big meeting at the publishing house. Then they have to take the pitch letter from the agent. They have to make their own pitch, basically. It's like a two-step process, right? The author writes the book, and then it's out there, right? The agent is rooting for the author. They make the pitch. The editor, if they fall for that pitch, they have to make their own pitch. They have to actually literally convince a top executive at the publishing house that they work for, this is a book that we need to publish. And that means they really need to believe in it. So Alvina Ling is going to explain to us what it takes to get her to believe in a book. One of the things she talks about is that publishing is a passion industry. She grew up reading books, she loved books, and that's why she got into publishing. This is basically how it works. If you want Alvina Ling to get your book published, there's a very simple 3-step process here. First of all, your book should remind her of a childhood book that she remembers from her childhood. Step 2, she should wish that the book existed when she was a child. And now she talks about mirrors versus windows, and I don't know what that means because I just wrote it offhand, so maybe you can tell me. What does mirrors versus windows mean to you?
One costs a lot more to replace than the other.
But one causes 7 years of bad luck, even though it's so much cheaper.
That is true.
That's
maybe it
odd,
has something
right?
to do with, mirrors, something that's a reflection of what you see, and another thing is just looking in on something, voyeuristically. So you have a book that's a reflection of what you see or what you know or what's around you versus just standing on the outside looking in on something.
I think she was talking more about not wanting to see a reflection of herself in a book, but she wanted to see herself through a window. Maybe that's what she was talking about. And then finally, the third step is that it has to resonate with her as an adult. The book that you're pitching to your boss, it better resonate with you, right? You're probably an adult if you work in the publishing industry. Makes sense. I guess I just didn't take away as much from her as I did from the author. Finally, the last step of the process is the bookseller. The agent can make the pitch, and the editor buys it, and the editor is able to successfully promote it within their own publishing house, and it gets actually published. Great. So now it has to go to the bookstore, and the bookstore actually has to sell it. And if it doesn't sell, the book doesn't make any money, and everybody loses. So really, this is where the rubber hits the road. What does the bookseller say about diverse books? Because at the end of the day, if we want diverse books, the diverse books have to sell. If the diverse books aren't selling, then we're not going to have diverse books because nobody wants to make diverse books if they don't make any money. It's really up to the booksellers to figure out, is this marketable? Can this be profitable? Do people want to buy diverse books? That's really where it comes down. And so now we got Sarah Hines, who owns a bookstore somewhere up in Massachusetts. So what she wants to talk about here is the blame game. the blame game when it comes to the lack of diverse books, because we can all agree there's fewer diverse books than there are non-diverse books. If we want to start blaming people for that, then her opinion is that the bookseller is to blame, because the responsibility for putting the information in the community is down to the people that are in the community, which are the local bookshops. If the books are not on the shelf, then it's the fault of the bookseller, and that is her philosophy. And she has a no exception rule about that. For her bookstore, diversity is the mission statement. What she wants to push is that diversity doesn't just happen. And you have to dive deeper in order to make it happen and get us to Diversity 2.0. And this is one of the major talking points of this panel, is Diversity 2.0 and how do we get there? You always have to ask yourself, what is the store representing? One of the ways you can get to a diverse representation on the store shelves is to have a diverse staff. Does your staff represent your community? If your community is X percentage whatever, X percentage whatever, and X percentage whatever, do you have those percentages represented in your staff? We talked about this earlier. We want our literary landscape to represent what we see in real life around us. If we see that there are people on the margins, we gotta get the people in the center to accept those people on the margins as part of society. Not as something other, but as something that is part of the whole. If they're not represented in art and literature and in any part of the culture, that's not going to happen. It's part of everybody's responsibility to make sure that we are all included. And this is going back to a point that Renee Watson made, which is that you need to show the world as it is. And this is really something that stuck with me throughout my experience at BookCon and BookExpo, which is that even if your main character is not diverse, that's completely fine, because a lot of people aren't diverse. That's totally natural, right? But why don't we just show that not everybody else looks the same? Yeah, so your main character is not diverse. That's fine. Maybe you're a white male author. That's totally cool. Maybe you want to write heterosexual male main character. Again, completely nothing wrong with that. All she's saying is like, hey, take a look at where this person lives, and let's have like a good representation of the types of people that they might interact with. Let's not whitewash this thing. I think that's reasonable. Create a realistic representation of our society today. When you're doing this, you have to also remember that we need to move past tokenism. What does that mean? That means add more. Even if you, quote unquote, already have one, that's fine. Add another one. Don't have the one token minority character, right? Oh, I already have an Asian. I don't have to have any other minorities. Dude, throw in a black dude. Who cares? Spread it out, you know? You know what I'm saying?
Throwing a black dude is like a very odd way of putting it. If you come off sounding a little insensitive or not saying the right things or using the right words.
Guys, before you flame us on Twitter, you have to recognize that I'm not with it. I'm really not with it. So, sorry. I'm probably on your side, unless you're like really militant about, what's the thing that I don't like people being militant about?
Fascism?
Yeah, no, obviously, if you're really militant about fascism, then go f*** yourself. Go ahead and flame us. I don't care. As somebody talking about the We Need Diversity in Books panel at BookExpo 2018, I must admit that I am aware of my shortcomings. As a white, cis, hetero male, I have to, admit that I have some shortcomings when it comes to talking about this panel. Obviously, I don't feel the same struggle that everybody on this panel does.
You mean every book written back in the day has you as the main character?
It's great. I love it. Probably part of what got me into books as a young kid. That being said, I understand what they're talking about, and I am totally with it. It's great. Bear with me if I slip up or say something wrong. Just don't flame us.
Like, I do come from it from a different perspective. Obviously, if anyone's been paying attention this entire episode, I'm very like, hey, Asian American representation, let's go. So I think one of the issues, when you were talking about, just throw in a black guy or something. I mean, you do have issues with narratives that have something like that because, it really depends on how the person writes them. And even they better have their sensitivity readers. They better have talked to people and really understood what they're doing and how they're going about their characters. You can't really just just throw some random people in there and make it more diverse. You have an Asian American, just throw a black guy. That is somewhat of a problem in some ways. You can't just throw random people just to... Because that is a form of tokenism too, if you put it like that.
This is actually a really good point that brings us to moving from Diversity 1.0 to Diversity 2.0. Because in Diversity 1.0, hey, look, I have one diverse character in my book, or I have a diverse character and then I have a token other diverse character that doesn't seem realistic at all. That's 1.0. 2.0, we're talking about authenticity and quality. And what that means is, hey, these people feel like they belong in the story. They're not completely inauthentic. They're written naturally. And they feel like, oh yeah, they could really belong here. It's not completely off base. They're described as being something, but then they don't act as whatever. That's what we're talking about. We're talking about a natural coming towards what we actually are as a society, because as America today, when we're looking at the demographic breakdown and we're looking at Black, Hispanic, Asian American, white, the demographic trends are shifting. And if you look at the way the books are written, that should really, shift with it. What we're talking about getting to Diversity 2.0 is to recognize that we live in a diverse society and recognize that an author should be able to write a book that actually represents accurately the society that they live in. And maybe that's expecting a little bit more of the author, but that's just the fact of it.
Shouldn't we be expecting more from the publishing world? I mean, you did talk about the life cycle of a diverse book. Shouldn't we be expecting the publishing world to be bringing in more of those diverse authors to bring that Diversity 2.0?
Absolutely. But if you look at the established authors, they should be able to include that diversity in their books already. Why don't we just talk about our favorite author, Joe Hill? The last book of his that I read was Nosferatu, and Nosferatu did not have diverse characters. It was just a bunch of white people romping around killing each other, and it's just like, guess what? There's black people in New England.
And also in The Fireman.
And the firemen, give me a break.
New Hampshire is pretty white.
Joe Hill is somebody we should call out. There's nothing wrong with writing books about New England, but there are minorities in New England, and if you look at the racial breakdown in New England, is not 100% white, and statistically speaking, if you look at the amount of characters in his book, I guarantee you he's underrepresenting. Is it on the publishing industry? Well, guess what? Joe Hill writes passably well, so that means it's on him.
So what's interesting, I'm looking at the demographic information. It's 93.3% white, 4.2% Asian, 2.3% Black, 0.2% American Indian, 5.1% Hispanic of any race. I mean, at the same time, he is writing the people that he knows. It's very difficult to have this conversation. There's so much nuance to it. It's very hard to say, oh, well, Joe Hill or Stephen King, they need to have this or that, because, I do feel like at some point they'll be like, oh, okay, well, I'll add that Asian character because what was it, 4% Asian? Well, then he'll be called out for tokenism. He'll be called out for, Orientalism. The fetishizing of his Asian women. I was like, oh, you're fetishizing Asian women. Why does it have to be Asian women? Why can't it be an Asian man? And then he'll have an Asian man and he'll say something like, oh, how dare you do that? I think there's that fear. So I think there is a fear on how to, and I'm going to use Asian because, that's what I know. So I would say, yeah, I get that. I get the fear that he might have in doing that. That's why I'm saying there does need to be a push in the publishing world to get more own voices, people out there. But I'm thinking about that N.K. Jemisin and Ann Leckie interview. And I'm thinking about how, my takeaway was, okay, you can have a white cis hetero male write a black gay character, but you can't write his coming out story. But maybe you can write him as a character in your book, but how do you approach writing that character? And it has to come with sensitivity of why is this character, why have you chosen to make this character black? Why have you chosen to make this character gay? And it has to come from, this person is in here because blah. For this reason. I've decided to not make this person white, not because I need to increase the racial diversity. I have made this conscious effort and I've put in the effort by doing this research. What is it like for an Asian to live in New Hampshire in a place that's 90-some% white? Because I'm an Asian that lives in a neighborhood that is very, very white. And I know how I feel here versus how I feel somewhere that isn't that high percentage white. When I go to our local college campus for stuff, it is very Asian. And I do feel a little more comfortable. Okay, I should be okay. Even though I'm not, a lot of them are international students, I still feel more at home with them than I do with, my fellow citizens here. When you write that character, you have to understand why or where that character is coming from and why that character is there. So I think when you talk about, oh, Joe Hill needs to increase the diversity of the book, maybe he does. Maybe he needs to show the demographics of New Hampshire. But if he does that, he better be doing the research as to like why. Because if he makes someone female, Asian American, or Asian, and it's like a love story, then it becomes, oh, Asian females always go with white guys. That's why he did it, because his main character's white. If he does it with another race, like, oh, he did that. So it does become very difficult for him, and I think part of the fear that why they don't go for that diversity push that people want from them is like this real genuine fear. Because, you talk about the C. Robert Cargill story. You just said, oh, how dare he do that? I didn't enjoy it at all because this white guy dared to do this, and I said it made me feel uncomfortable. But at the same time, hey, this guy is putting out Australian mythology. Isn't that what we just asked for? Aren't we being hypocritical? On the one side, we're saying, like, that story was problematic in many ways. But on the other side, he did bring this diversity to it. And I don't think he handled it that poorly. I mean, there's like that white savior type thing, which is kind of weird, which no one likes. But there was also like a genuine interest in that mythology that he was dealing with. Like, it's something that you had read about previously. It is a difficult line to walk. And it is a very nuanced discussion. And, as someone who's not a writer, as someone who isn't in a field where I necessarily have to like put myself out there to be judged aside from this podcast, it's very hard for me to say like what they have to do. As a reviewer, I can say all I want, but at the end of the day, it's something like they do need to consult with their friends who are maybe more diverse than I am. Maybe his like other racially diverse friends, his, non-cisgendered friends, his non-hetero friends. Like, that's for him to decide and him to talk with them and him to have a real feeling of, hey, is he comfortable doing what we're asking? Because if he's not, it's going to come off really, really poorly. And I have read books where it's just cloying to read, where you're like, I can see that you're trying to make this diverse, but wow, this rubs me the wrong way. Like that Andy Weir book. He's an author that was really, really big with The Martian. His first book was like this white guy who was, I'm going to science the shit out of this. And then his second book was the complete opposite, of Middle Eastern descent, female, Muslim. She's sort of like a criminal and she's going against her family, and there's like a lot to her. And that's like a really interesting story. It was really great. This author who is really big, everyone's highly anticipating this book, and he chose to make this diverse push. He made this effort of like, you know what? I will go with something completely different. I'm going to push, a feminist agenda. I'm going to push this diversity because I can. Because I, as a white guy, can get this out there, and I know that my mainly cis white hetero readership is going to read this, and some will hate it, and some will be like, oh, wow, you did this. So, good on him for doing that. But I know when I read Artemis, I was like, she does not read correctly to me. And I know it's like, everyone has their own personality, and this is just how he chose to write her. How can you say that she doesn't read like a real person? Like, maybe there is a person that's exactly like her. And you know what? You may well be correct. She might be based on his best friend, and I don't even know it. But at the same time, me reading it, it came off very much, she seems like a character that I've seen before. He's pulled characteristics that he's seen from other places, put it in her. That's how it came off to me. So, good on him for pushing for that diversity. Then there's assholes like me who go, oh, you didn't do it correctly. But at the same time, I recognize, oh, on the one hand, I can go, hey, I understand what you're doing. I understand what you're going for. I'm glad you went there. But on the other hand, I was also going, oh, maybe I wish you didn't go there because some of it comes off very odd, and I'm not here for that. I think a woman would have written this book a lot better than what you've just done. And it's like the battle of that.
Right, so I think the point that Renee Watson is trying to make here is that we're not talking about the main character. You write your main character was what you're comfortable to write your main character. As far as Andy Weir, maybe he did feel comfortable writing her because maybe, as you said, one of his best friends was exactly like that, and we just don't know about it. Okay, that's great. I can accept that. But that's not what she's talking about. She's talking about, hey, what about all the little side characters, right? These are people that are just fill out the background of the book, and they can represent the actual correct racial breakdown. Because let's go back to Joe Hill. We're talking about like 10% of New England is not white, if I remember that correctly. And yeah, guess what? 100% of New England is white as far as he's concerned. So that's kind of what we're talking about there.
My whole rant was basically, I feel like for some people or for some authors, I'm not speaking for him because I don't know him, obviously, and he's his own person.
No, you were saying it could feel like tokenism because if you have 100 characters and only one of them is a minority, but you're writing for a place that's 99% white, or whatever, that means that one minority seems like tokenism, but, maybe that correctly represents. So, just go with it. Go with your thing.
What I'm saying is that not only can it feel like tokenism, but what I'm saying is, I just gave a whole thing about Andy Weir's main character from Artemis.
Mm-hmm.
Now imagine having that character in a very small package as a background character. People are just going to be like, that character just didn't feel right. If you don't know how to write a minority character, maybe you shouldn't have written it. That sort of thing.
As a background character, you don't get as much scrutiny. So if you don't feel quite right...
I have definitely written reviews about books that have background characters that aren't written correctly. There is a danger even in background characters.
Okay, but let's say I am a person that has not been exposed to diversity whatsoever, and I have no clue what a Muslim Arab female should sound like or act like, and then she's like a little side character. I'm probably just going to believe whatever the author says and be like, okay, yeah, that's probably what they're like. Okay, good.
There's two different sides for this, right? On the one side, you are now talking about how that author will influence someone who's completely ignorant's view on a specific group of people. But you also have to look at it from the point of view of someone who is in that group, who's going to be reading that book, and they're going to be confused. Okay. So if you're not writing that correctly, you're giving one group that's completely ignorant the wrong picture, and you're hurting a group that you're talking about. I mean, that is the point of having, like, sensitivity readers, to have people call you out on your ignorance in writing. Hey, that's not what you do. Let's say you all go out to, like, a Chinese restaurant in the book, and they're all, like, enjoying a meal and whatever. And then at some point, the author has the character going, oh, I have to go to the bathroom. And they stick their chopsticks into the rice and walk away. Obviously, in Chinese culture, you don't do that. But if he doesn't do his research, and he doesn't have someone read, like a sensitivity reader, call him out and like, hey, that's actually really insensitive. You don't do that at a Chinese dinner table. Then he's not going to know. And then someone who doesn't know anything about Chinese culture, like someone who is ignorant, will be like, oh, okay, yeah, that's something I do. That's fine. And but someone who knows about that as an issue will go, wait, that's a problem. Like, why didn't someone catch it? Like, someone should have known. There should be someone in the upper echelons reading this book who should have called him out on that. That's one of those little things. By having a side character, you should be sensitive of everything that side character represents, even if that side character doesn't necessarily represent just their one little aspect of themselves. I mean, like I said, this is a very nuanced discussion.
Right, that's the thing. That's all the nuances, because at the end of the day, when you talk about nuances, right, you can't please everybody. I think what we can say is, let's try. Let's give people an A for effort, because right now, we're not seeing an A for effort. And that's the thing. Eventually, we're going to get to Diversity 2.0, where everybody's not just trying, but actually succeeding, and we all accept each other's cultures and understand all the intersectionalities and yada yada. But we're not there yet. In order to get there, we have to get to that first stage where we're actually trying. And then the next generation can actually take over. The readers that grow up reading the books that we write today are going to be the ones that write the books of tomorrow that are going to get us to that next stage. Let's not ask too much of ourselves. Let's all do the best that we can do. Even if it's not like 100% there, let's not be overly critical. Let's recognize, like, hey, Andy Weir's trying. That's good. I think he's starting a conversation.
I think you should be overly critical. Like, for instance, I hope Andy Weir got feedback that went, dude, this did not read right.
Well, it shouldn't be overly, it should just be critical.
So LTLV is actually this weekend, and something that came out from one of the panels is that diversity without inclusion is tokenism, which is what we were talking about. And basically the point is, I mean, they're talking about a panel, but basically if you're going to have someone there from a certain group, it's important to, like, listen to them and get feedback. And I think in terms of writing a book, that's where your sensitivity readers or your friends come into play, just so you can have an understanding of, even if it's a background character, even if it's someone that's in like 20 pages, just, like, knowing what it's like to be in that situation from that point of view is important.
Absolutely. And that's another interesting point. It goes back to what I was saying earlier, right? About C. Robert Cargill. He writes this story. It didn't seem authentic to me. It rubbed me the wrong way. Am I an Australian Aborigine? By no means. Have I ever met one? No, never. But it seemed unauthentic. And I could feel it. And that is something that I feel like everybody can feel, no matter what background they come from. If something feels like a token character that is just there to represent something for the sake of representing something, doesn't feel realistic,
just
isn't
to
authentic.
have the Australian Aboriginal myth there for the story as opposed to why is
Everyone's gonna know that. Everybody can feel that. As humans, we can sniff out a con. We know when something is fake. In literature, as readers, as fans of books, as consumers of books, we can sense that. So be authentic about it. As authentic as you can be. And that is what we can expect from you.
Well, I mean, not talking about books or authors. I'm going to talk about, the X-Files.
Mm-hmm.
The writer's room for the X-Files, historically, is very known to be very male. So for years, Scully is a great, great character, and some of the writers did find her voice, and some, really struggled to find her voice. But in the latest season of the X-Files that came out, you don't want to hear my rant about the X-Files, it's fine, I get it. I have a lot to rant about. It's fine, don't worry. But there was actually a huge uproar that why are there no women in this writer's room? And Gillian Anderson was like, come on guys. So finally they had women. I think they had a couple of women on the writing staff. So I forgot how many episodes they had. Was it 8 episodes? It was too many. They didn't need any episodes. But the point is...
It was a minuscule number of episodes, actually.
It was just too many. It shouldn't have happened. But the point is, there was an episode, the one with the AI one. So that was written by a woman, or both women, I don't know.
It was great.
It was one of the best episodes, first of all. Second of all, the way Scully was written was phenomenal. And it was Scully in a way that I think it would have been a very different episode had someone like Chris Carter written it. And by the way, Chris Carter as a writer, he does not know how to write women. And that was my issue with a lot of the My Struggle episodes. God, it was my struggle watching it. But my point is, when Chris Carter writes an episode of The X-Files, Scully is written in a very specific way that does not come off naturally, it doesn't come off normally, and she's often in the background of these episodes. She's firmly Mulder's partner. Whereas when there's someone who has a good grasp of her, she's either on the forefront or she has a voice that fits. And it's really interesting. You can see that on a TV show and it's very obvious. I challenge anyone to watch the series finale of the X-Files and watch that AI episode that starts in the restaurant. I forgot what it's called. And you can see the difference in Scully's there. And my argument is that if you can see that in a TV show, you can see it in a book. You can see the difference in that TV show, then you have to read a book in the same way and go, you know what? This feels inauthentic to me. Okay, I see what, people mean when they talk about authenticity in terms of different diverse characters. Or obviously talking about in terms of not just gender or race. We're talking about sexuality as well. If you really struggle to understand what we're saying here, just go watch those 2 episodes of The X-Files and I guarantee you'll understand oh, okay, I see. Scully is 2 very different people. She's written very differently. What she says, what happens to her, very, very different.
Yeah, I agree. Gender is the easiest way to see this, because no matter what background you came from, you have interacted with the opposite gender. This is the universal norm, right? No matter where you come from, you have interacted with the other gender. If somebody wrote the other gender completely wrong, you can see it. Extrapolate from that logically, yeah, guess what? Coming from a different background, you behave differently in different situations. That's just how it happens. So if you see somebody that's behaving in a situation and from your experience, maybe you're from the same background as that character and that's not how you have experienced people from that background to behave generally, that's going to strike you as odd and that's maybe just not going to feel right. But hey, getting to Diversity 2.0 is a journey, and the very first step of the journey is to start off on it. So if you're not even trying, if you're you know what, screw it, I'm gonna have all my characters be the exact same race, gender, whatever as me, then you're not helping. Let's just try to make our characters in our books representative of our society as a whole. And do the best that you can at it. Okay, maybe you're not going to do the best job. Don't listen to Anna as much, She's going to criticize you. Okay, whatever. But, guess what? At least you tried. Take it from me. I think that's a good first step to take. Even if you piss off people like Anna and they complain that it's not authentic, look, you tried. You gave that representation out there. And to some people that aren't Anna, it might open their minds up a little bit more. So actually, you helped. So let's do that.
So we obviously come from different perspectives here, and that's fine. People are going to be coming from different perspectives all the time. It's a very nuanced discussion. We could literally just go on talking about the same thing for hours, but we really don't want to. And I know a lot of you guys who are listening are going to have opinions. And maybe we said something that you agreed with. Maybe we said something you didn't agree with. Honestly, like we said, it could go on forever. It's nuanced. It's really hard to, I think, verbalize the nuance in some ways. Like, I'm not very good at speaking. I'm the worst speaker. Give me, a keyboard and let me type it out and let me, edit it for hours and maybe I can get my point across. But speaking in the moment during a recording session is difficult. And we all have opinions on this. I obviously think about this topic a lot. I buy the We Need Diverse books. It's a topic that I feel very, very strongly about in many different ways. And sometimes it's just hard to put all those different ways I think about it into words and then from the words out of my mouth to you guys because so many thoughts want to come out at once and I wish I could just scream and everything I think would just be in your ears and that would just be so much easier. So if we rubbed you the wrong way, sorry. This is a very difficult topic to discuss and neither one of us are in fields that...
No, absolutely. Look, I'm basically a nerd, nerds, and an engineer, right?
And a physicist.
These are like nerds, engineers, physicists don't communicate socially very well. I probably said 100 things, 1,000 things that are triggering people left and right, and I'm sorry. Look, I don't want to piss anybody off. I'm just trying to say my own opinion here. And,
while trying to read off what you think people had said based on what you had written on a panel of a topic that you actually went in knowing very little about.
In my defense, I feel like I learned a lot. I feel like this was very important for me, and I do believe this is a very important issue that did convince me that this is something that we all need to care about as a society.
Well, I have a question, even though we're wrapping up.
Yeah, go ahead.
But you're an immigrant. You immigrated when you were 9 years old. I can't really think of many immigrant experience books. Something like The Goldfinch did have an immigrant as a background character or a secondary character at one point. But do you wish that you had read more books that had immigrant main characters like yourself, or were you just firmly in the sci-fi, fantasy, whatever? I don't really care about realistic fiction. Do you think it would have helped you? Because I know that you told me a story about how you messed up your W's and your V's and people laughed at you and you couldn't figure out why people were laughing at you.
Right. So that's the thing. I had one immigrant struggle story. Due to my natural character of being gripey and angry and holding a grudge, I have held this grudge and been griping about it ever since. If that's the worst part of my immigrant experience, then clearly I am coming from a very privileged perspective because a lot of people's immigrant experience is unimaginably worse from that. We are living in a time period where kids are torn away from their parents, kept in detention, and locked up in cages, not allowed to touch or hug each other, basically mentally tortured simply because their parents chose them to bring them to this country. Kids that are the same age that I was when my parents brought me to this country, or younger. And so my experience is completely different. I come from a very privileged experience of coming to America, and I recognize that. I'm always going to speak up for immigrant rights. I don't have anywhere near the hardship that a lot of the people have to come through to get to this country. Some of that has to do with how people perceive me when they look at me and they see the color of my skin. But at the end of the day,
well,
I didn't need that, but there's a lot of immigrants in this country that do need that story that represents them. And I can see that.
Well, because I was going to say, I'm going to sound really just dumb now, but I was going to say, because I know my experience. Apparently, I'm second generation, not first generation, which I thought, because I was the first generation born here, I'd be first generation. But no, apparently I'm second generation. I know that the experience I had growing up as a second gen, being a child of immigrants, their immigrant story, is not something that I read growing up. And I remember the first book I ever read, aside from having Claudia Kishi from the Babysitters Club, but I remember the first book I read that had an Asian, second gen lives with the grandparents story. That was my story that has an older brother who's a lot smarter. And I remember I was in 7th grade. I actually stole the book from the classroom. because like I had never experienced something, and I feel awful that I still have the book. I'm sorry I stole your book in 7th grade. I'm sorry.
Think of all the other second-gen Asians that missed out on that.
Well, actually, I don't think there were any in like, because I was in 7th grade. So the thing is, our community of Asian Americans were so small, I can name every single one that was in that school with me. That's how small the Asian American population was, first of all, for like that period of time I was there. It's different now. The point is, like, I still have the book. It's called April and the Dragon Lady. And I just remember, like, in 7th grade, how much that resonated with me and how I had wished, like, I had read that book before, because I read that book so many times. I'm sorry I stole it, but I read it, like, maybe once a week for a really long time. And I just remember how important that was to me. So that's why I'm asking how you would have felt reading your own sort of story.
Who did I read? I read Tolkien. What did Tolkien base his books on? European mythology. Yeah, so I come from a European background, so I felt right at home in that. And that's kind of how it is. It's different. I'm not going to claim like...
Just because you're an immigrant doesn't necessarily mean you feel othered in this country?
It's weird. I can make myself feel othered, but others don't. It's a complicated thing, but it's definitely not the same kind of thing that you go through. Again, diverse books. Guys, we all have our own thing, right? So let's represent the things that we all have. Somebody's gonna be out there reading the thing and be like, hey, that's my thing. And that's cool. That's what we're talking about. That's exactly what we're talking about.
Aspiring writers out there, just remember, diversity 2.0. Try your best. People, you'll be applauded, you'll be ridiculed, but it's time for a change.
The change is happening. Whether you want it or not, it's happening. Society is always going to shift, and we're in the middle of a shift, and that's basically all there is to it. We're just talking about something that's happening whether we want it to or not.
I will say a lot of the whole immigrant refugee thing that Serge and I were talking about, I actually did go to a refugee panel at BookCon, and you'll hear about it in our BookCon episode. I won't talk about it now, but you raised a very interesting point there.
Okay, yeah.
We're wrapped for BookExpo. We're going to talk about BookCon next. I do want to say, listen, if you got something constructive to say about this whole long discussion we have, if you made it to this part of the episode, actually, congrats. And if you want to comment or talk about it or discuss it, just leave a comment in YouTube or DM us or tweet at us. I am really sorry if we've said something that just rubbed you the complete wrong way. Like I said, it's so nuanced. We're so not the people in any of the panels that talked about diversity or the importance of it. It's not something we're adept at, but we're trying to, not just talk about what Serge heard at the panels and have him read out his notes, but also we do have our own opinions. And if we didn't verbalize them correctly, or if we just said something horribly just wrong, or
guys, basically, if you're pissed off about what you just heard, message us, because we want to hear it. We want to get your feedback. On the flip side, if you're totally supportive or you're happy that we shared our experience at
message
BookExpo,
us as well.
Exactly.
Except if you're someone who doesn't like diversity, maybe don't message us, because we're really not interested in hearing about your racist or homophobic or any, transphobic issues. I don't want to hear it.
Or, you know what? Troll us anyway. It's fine.
Yeah, there's a great mute button or a block button that I will use, and you can just tweet to your heart's content about how you're just an asshole.
All right, guys. Thank you so much for listening. I know this one's been a long way coming. BookExpo was so long ago, but again, a bunch of work stuff came up, and I just couldn't be here for it. I'm really sorry. All I can say is it was unavoidable.
So stay tuned for our BookCon episode coming shortly after this episode is released, hopefully.
Bye. We hope you enjoyed this episode of Read Podcast.
Join us again as we continue our journey down Fear Street.
We love hearing from you guys, so feel free to reach out to us at Podcast on Twitter and Facebook.
Email us at ret.read.podcast@gmail.com.
Don't forget to rate, and subscribe.
Once again, thanks for listening. See you again soon.